interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Afternoon light filtered through wire-reinforced windows, casting geometric shadows across a metal table that had seen 1,000 conversations just like this one. Colonel Heinrich Steiner sat with his hands folded, watching dust motes drift through the September air like the ghosts of men he'd known. 61 years old, gray hair cropped military short, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Across from him, Major Douglas Patterson of the United States Army Historical Division arranged his recording equipment with the careful precision of a man who understood that some stories deserved to be preserved exactly as they were told. 38 years old, pressed uniform, wedding ring catching the light, young enough to have missed the war. Old enough to understand its weight, the tape reels began their slow rotation. "Colonel Steiner," Patterson began, his German accented but clear, "you served as Chief Intelligence Officer for Army Group South from November 1942 through the end of the war. You documented everything: casualty reports, production figures, operational assessments. Your records are the most comprehensive we've found." Steiner said nothing. Just watched the tape spin. "I need to understand something," Patterson continued. "When did you know? When did you realize Germany would lose the war?" The question hung in the air between them. Outside, somewhere in the American compound in West Germany, a radio played music from before the world burned. Perry Como singing about dreams and tomorrow. Steiner leaned forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had stopped lying to himself a long time ago. "February 8, 1943, 6 days after Stalingrad fell." Patterson's pen stopped mid-note. 6 days? Not later. Not after Kursk or... 6 days. Steiner reached into the worn leather satchel at his feet and withdrew a journal. Field gray cover, edges stained with age and weather. He opened it to a page marked with a strip of faded ribbon. "This is what I wrote that morning." He turned the journal so Patterson could see. "February 8, 1943, 07 hours. Soviet offensive commenced across entire front. 40-plus divisions. Direction of main effort, Kursk-Kharkov axis. Expected Soviet recovery time, 3 to 6 months. Actual Soviet recovery time, 6 days." He closed the journal. "That's when I knew. The rest was just arithmetic." Patterson leaned back in his chair. The tape reels continued their patient rotation, capturing everything. "Start at the beginning," he said. "Tell me how you counted your way to the end of the world." Steiner looked out the window at the German autumn, at a country that had survived its own suicide by the narrowest of margins. Then he began. "February 2nd, 1943, the day the transmissions from Stalingrad stopped. The basement office of Army Group South headquarters in Zaporozhye had once been a wine cellar. Now it housed 3 filing cabinets, 2 telephones, a radio receiver, and 1 colonel who preferred shadows to searchlights. Heinrich Steiner had requisitioned the space specifically because no one bothered him there. Down here, away from the war room upstairs with its colored pins and confident voices, he could work with the numbers that mattered, the numbers that told the truth. His desk lamp threw yellow light across maps marked with his own annotations. Not the official maps that showed the front line as a solid red arc across southern Russia. His maps showed something different. Gaps, weaknesses, units that existed on paper, but not in reality. The honest accounting of an army that had been bleeding for 18 months and was running out of blood. The radio receiver crackled with static. Background noise mostly, routine traffic from units up and down the line. Then, at 00:47 hours, the Stalingrad frequency went silent. Just static. The empty hiss of a frequency with no one left to transmit. Steiner made a notation in his log. Final transmission, 6th Army concluded 0847. Estimated strength at final position, less than 2,000 combat effective. Total casualties Stalingrad operation, approximately 300,000 personnel. He underlined the number twice. 300,000, an entire army. Gone. Footsteps on the stairs. Heavy boots, confident stride. Field Marshal Ernst von Waldheim descended into the cellar, ducking his head beneath the low stone archway. 58 years old, Iron Cross First Class pinned to his collar, bearing of a man who had spent 4 years turning impossible situations into victories through sheer tactical brilliance. He looked tired. "Stalingrad?" he asked. "Ended 11 minutes ago," Steiner replied. "The silence is official now." Waldheim moved to the map table, studying the positions with the focused intensity that had made him one of Germany's most successful field commanders. 3 months, he said, perhaps 4. The Soviets will need time to recover, to rebuild. We can use that time to consolidate, to prepare for summer operations. Steiner said nothing. He'd learned over 2 years on the Eastern Front that sometimes silence was the only honest response. "You disagree?" Waldheim glanced at him. "I think," Steiner chose his words carefully, "that we should be prepared for contingencies beyond our current planning assumptions." Meaning? "Meaning the Russians have surprised us before." Waldheim smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Heinrich, you worry too much. The Stalingrad offensive cost them dearly. Even the Russians need time to replace losses on that scale. We've earned a pause. Both sides have." A knock at the doorframe. A young lieutenant stood at attention, road dust on his uniform, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had driven through the night. "Sir, Lieutenant Klaus Weber reporting as ordered." 24 years old, fresh from the War Academy, blonde hair, blue eyes, everything the propaganda posters promised about German youth. And something else Steiner recognized immediately in the set of his jaw, the way he held himself. The son of Jakob Weber, who had been Steiner's closest friend before a Soviet shell made that friendship past tense. "Lieutenant," Waldheim straightened. "Welcome to Army Group South. You've been assigned as an intelligence liaison. Colonel Steiner will orient you to our procedures." Klaus saluted. Perfect form, everything by the book. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to serve under Field Marshal von Waldheim. With our victory at Stalingrad, when do we launch the summer offensive?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt longer. Waldheim and Steiner exchanged a glance. The field marshal's expression said everything. Young, eager, still believes the radio broadcasts. "Lieutenant," Waldheim said gently, "Stalingrad was not a victory. Not for anyone. Colonel Steiner will explain the situation. Welcome to the real war." He left. Boots on stairs fading into the levels above, where maps showed what men wanted to see instead of what actually existed. Klaus stood uncertain, still at attention. "Sir, did I say something wrong?" "At ease, Lieutenant." Steiner gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have work to do. And first you need to understand what kind of work it is." The young officer sat, ramrod straight, notebook already open. Eager, ready to learn, ready to serve. Steiner looked at him and saw Jakob Weber, 30 years younger. Saw every young officer who had come through this basement believing the war was a story with heroes and villains and clean endings. Saw what the Eastern Front did to those beliefs. "What did they teach you at the War Academy about enemy capabilities assessment?" Steiner asked. "Standard methodology, sir. Order of battle analysis, production capacity estimates, morale indicators, supply line vulnerability." "And what did they teach you to do when reality contradicts your estimates?" Klaus hesitated. "Sir?" "It's not a trick question, Lieutenant. What do you do when the enemy does something your analysis says they cannot do?" "I revise the analysis, sir, based on new data." "Wrong." Steiner opened one of his filing cabinets and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "What you do is accept that your fundamental assumptions were incorrect. Not your analysis, your assumptions. There's a difference." He spread documents across the desk. Intelligence summaries, production reports, casualty estimates. His private collection, the numbers he compiled when official channels gave answers that made no sense. June 1941, we invaded the Soviet Union with 3 million men. High Command estimated Soviet military strength at 150 divisions. Total industrial capacity sufficient to support a war lasting 6 to 8 weeks. We expected Moscow by October. Klaus nodded. Common knowledge, even if it hadn't worked out that way. By December 1941, Steiner continued, we had identified over 360 Soviet divisions. Not 150, 360. Where did they come from, Lieutenant? Did they materialize from thin air? They must have been hidden? In reserve? They didn't exist. Not when we invaded. They were created after we attacked. Mobilized, equipped, trained, and deployed in 6 months. We assumed the Soviets couldn't do that. Our assumption was wrong. Not our analysis. Our assumption. Steiner pulled out a single sheet, columns of numbers in his precise handwriting. Soviet tank production, 1942. Based on official German intelligence estimates, 8,000 vehicles. Based on data from field identification, captured documents, and agent reports, 24,000 vehicles. Klaus stared at the number. 24,000? That's 3 times our estimate. Actually, Steiner said quietly, that year we produced 9,000 tanks. They outbuilt us by a ratio of nearly 3 to 1, and those are conservative figures. The real number might be higher. The young lieutenant's expression shifted. Steiner had seen that look before. The moment when the propaganda met reality and reality didn't blink. Sir, if those numbers are accurate, they are. Then the strategic situation is far worse than public statements suggest? Yes. Does the field marshal know? I brief him weekly. He knows. High command knows. Everyone who needs to know, knows. Steiner lit a cigarette, taking his time. Knowing and accepting are different things. We know the numbers. We choose not to accept what they mean. Klaus sat back, processing. Young but not stupid. That was good. Stupid officers died quickly. Smart ones died slowly, understanding every step of the path that led to their end. Sir, Klaus said carefully, why are you telling me this? On my first day? Steiner studied the lieutenant. Saw his friend's features in the younger face. Saw the son Jakob had written about in letters that arrived less and less frequently before they stopped arriving at all. Because your father asked me to look after you if anything happened to him, and because you deserve to know what kind of war you're actually fighting. He paused. Write this date in your notebook, Lieutenant. February 8th, 2 days from now. Remember it. Why? Because that's when your illusions die. Klaus frowned but made the notation. February 8th, 1943. Question mark beside it. Now, Steiner stubbed out his cigarette, let me show you how to read a casualty report. Not the numbers they file with Berlin, the real numbers. The ones that tell you how a war actually ends. February 3rd passed in routine work. Klaus learned the filing system, the reporting procedures, the delicate art of translating battlefield chaos into bureaucratic documentation. He was quick, efficient, asked good questions. Reminded Steiner painfully of Jakob at that age, before the Eastern Front had worn him down to the man who died outside Moscow in the winter of '41. February 4th brought the first anomalous reports. Soviet reconnaissance activity increasing along the northern sectors. Troop movements detected near Voronezh. Nothing major, but enough to note. Steiner noted everything. February 5th, the pattern intensified. Radio intercepts suggested Soviet units redeploying, not retreating, repositioning for something. Supply movements, Klaus observed, reviewing the transcripts. Artillery concentrations. Sir, this reads like offensive preparations. It does, Steiner agreed. He was compiling his own assessment, cross-referencing agent reports with signals intelligence, with prisoner interrogations. Building a picture that made his stomach tight. But they just finished Stalingrad 6 days ago, Klaus said. They can't possibly be ready for another major offensive. Remember what I told you about assumptions, Lieutenant? February 6th. More reports. Soviet tank formations identified north of Kursk. Fresh divisions, not the units that had been ground down in the Stalingrad fighting. New armies appearing where intelligence had predicted exhausted remnants would be nursing their wounds. Steiner worked through the night, updating his maps, calculating timelines, checking and rechecking his figures. By dawn on February 7th, he had compiled a 15-page assessment that contradicted every assumption German planning was based on. He carried it upstairs to Waldheim's office at 600 hours. The field marshal was already awake, studying maps by lamplight, coffee steaming on his desk, the good stuff that came from packages sent from home, not the ersatz mud they served in the mess. Heinrich, you look like you haven't slept. I haven't. Steiner placed the assessment on the desk. You need to read this. Now. Waldheim picked up the document, eyes scanning the opening summary. His expression didn't change, but Steiner had known him long enough to read the tension in his shoulders. Soviet offensive preparations, Waldheim read aloud. Multiple axes, Kursk, Kharkov, possibly Rostov. Estimated strength 40-plus divisions. He looked up. In 6 days? This is impossible. It's happening. No. Waldheim set the report down carefully. No. This is reconnaissance activity, probing. They're testing our lines, looking for weakness. Standard practice after a major operation. With 40 divisions? 40 fresh divisions that weren't engaged at Stalingrad? Your figures are based on preliminary identification. It could be the same units moving between sectors, inflating the count. Steiner had expected this. Page 7. Unit identification confirmed by 3 separate methods. These are new formations. They weren't at Stalingrad. They've been held in reserve, and now they're moving forward. Waldheim read page 7, then page 8. His coffee went cold. Even if this is accurate, he said finally, they still need time to coordinate, to establish supply lines, to prepare proper artillery support. We're looking at weeks minimum, more likely a month. Sir, I recommend we begin preparing fallback positions immediately. If they attack in less than 2 weeks, which is logistically impossible, we respond with mobile defense. Trade space for time. This is not Stalingrad. We're not trapped. We can maneuver. Waldheim stood, moving to the situation map on his wall. I've been fighting Russians for 2 years, Heinrich. I know their capabilities. They don't have magic railways that move armies overnight. They also couldn't build 24,000 tanks in a year. But they did. The field marshal turned. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or the first recognition that the war he thought he understood was something else entirely. File your assessment with High Command, Waldheim said. Alert all sector commands to increase readiness status. But Heinrich, don't mistake caution for panic. The Soviets are good. They're not supernatural. Steiner returned to his basement office and filed the report. Official channels, proper procedure, everything documented. Then he filed a second copy in his personal records, the ones he kept for the history that would be written later by whoever survived to write it. Klaus was waiting, maps already updated with the latest intelligence. Sir, these concentration patterns, they're textbook offensive preparation. By the book, exactly what we do in their position. What conclusion does that suggest to you, Lieutenant? That they're planning exactly what it looks like. A major offensive, soon. He paused. But everyone says it's impossible. Everyone said Stalingrad was a temporary setback. Everyone said the Russians would collapse after the first winter. Everyone has been wrong about almost everything since June 1941. Steiner looked at his calendar. February 7th, 1943. Tomorrow is the 8th. Remember what I told you. That my illusions would die. Yes, Klaus met his eyes. What if I don't have illusions, sir? What if I'm just trying to understand what's real? Steiner almost smiled. Then you're already ahead of most of the officer corps. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But neither of them slept. They worked through the night, monitoring reports, updating assessments, watching the intelligence picture crystallize into something that made strategic sense only if you accepted that the impossible was about to become real. At 0430 hours on February 8th, the telephone rang. Steiner picked it up. Intelligence, Colonel Steiner. The voice on the other end belonged to Major Richter, operations officer for XU-1, Ekidori Panzer Corps. Professional, clipped, with an undertone of controlled chaos. Colonel, you need to get up here. Now. Something's happening. Soviet offensive? A pause. Background noise, shouting, the distinct sound of war rooms shifting from routine to crisis. Everything. They're hitting everything. Multiple axes, division strength formations, artillery preparation across the entire northern sector. It's the whole front. Steiner checked his watch. 432 hours, 6 days and 19 hours after Stalingrad fell silent. I'll be right up. He hung up and looked at Klaus, who had heard enough to understand. The young lieutenant was pale but steady. Get your notebook. Steiner said. Today you learn what it's like when reality stops pretending to match the plans. They climbed the stairs together, leaving the quiet certainty of the basement for the organized chaos of the operations floor. The war room pulsed with urgent energy, staff officers clustered around map tables, telephone lines lighting up like a switchboard, catching fire. Waldheim stood at the center, studying the incoming reports with the focused intensity of a man watching his certainties dissolve in real time. Heinrich, he didn't look up. Your assessment was optimistic. They're not hitting with 40 divisions. Current estimate is closer to 60. Steiner moved to the map, red arrows sprouting across the northern sectors like infection spreading through healthy tissue. Soviet offensive, multiple axes, exactly as his report had projected, except larger, faster, more coordinated than even his worst-case scenarios suggested. Direction of main effort? He asked. Kursk and Kharkov, secondary attacks toward Rostov. Waldheim's finger traced the arrows. They're not probing. They're not testing. This is a full offensive. 6 days after Stalingrad. Klaus stood at Steiner's shoulder, notebook open, hand moving mechanically to record the briefing. But his eyes were fixed on the map, watching the red arrows multiply as new reports flooded in. How? He whispered. How is this possible? Steiner didn't answer. The question was rhetorical anyway. The how didn't matter anymore. Only the what and the what next. Waldheim issued orders with the calm precision of a professional dealing with a crisis he understood, even if the scale exceeded expectations. Mobile reserves to threatened sectors. Fighting withdrawal where necessary. No panic, no heroic stands, just professional military practice adapted to circumstances that shouldn't exist but did. We need to know what we're facing, Waldheim said. Heinrich, I need order of battle. Unit identification. Is this the Stalingrad armies or fresh formations? I'll start compiling reports. Steiner gestured to Klaus. Come on, Lieutenant. Time to see if reality matches our assumptions. Back in the basement, they worked with focused intensity. Every prisoner interrogation, every radio intercept, every piece of intelligence that could identify the attacking units. Building the picture piece by piece. By noon, the picture was clear and impossible. Sir, Klaus said, staring at the identification chart they constructed, these aren't the Stalingrad armies. These are completely different formations, fresh divisions. Most of them were identified in the Moscow region in January. Distance from Moscow to Kursk? Steiner asked, though he already knew. Klaus calculated. Approximately 450 kilometers by rail. Say 300 miles. They moved 300 miles in less than a week, with all their equipment, supplies, artillery, established offensive positions, coordinated with adjacent units, and launched a major operation 6 days after concluding another major operation 300 miles away. The lieutenant sat back. Our logistics manuals say that's impossible. Then our logistics manuals are wrong, or theirs are better, or both. Steiner lit a cigarette, studying the chart. Write this down, Klaus. Soviet Tank Corps identified at Stalingrad on January 31st, now confirmed in action near Kursk on February 8th. Transit time, 7 days. German equivalent movement, estimated 3 to 4 weeks minimum. Klaus wrote, but his hand was shaking slightly. Sir, if they can do this routinely, if this is their standard operational capability. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implications hung in the basement air, like smoke from Steiner's cigarette. If the Soviets could redeploy armies this quickly, if they could move with this kind of speed and coordination, then every German planning assumption about operational tempo was obsolete. The entire Eastern Front strategy was built on the premise that German mobility and tactical skill could compensate for Soviet numerical superiority. But if the Soviets could move just as fast while fielding 3 times the numbers, the math stopped being math and became prophecy. Over the next 4 days, they compiled data that made the prophecy clearer. Soviet advances of 30 to 40 kilometers per day in some sectors. Entire German divisions simply overwhelmed. Not outfought, but buried under weight of numbers. Towns and positions marked secure on yesterday's map, falling before today's reports could be filed. Steiner documented everything. Unit identifications, loss rates, Soviet operational patterns. building a comprehensive picture of an enemy who wasn't supposed to exist. Not this strong, not this fast, not this good. Klaus learned quickly, shed his academy assumptions faster than most. By February 12th, he was identifying patterns in the Soviet operations that matched German tactical doctrine. By the 15th, he was predicting Soviet movements with uncomfortable accuracy. "They're not fighting like Soviets anymore," he observed during one late-night session. "These operations look like our own manuals." "They've been learning," Steiner said. "While we've been assuming they're inferior, they've been studying, adapting, improving, and now they're teaching us the lesson we should have learned 2 years ago." "What lesson?" "That underestimating your enemy is the fastest way to lose a war." By mid-February, the immediate crisis stabilized. Soviet advances slowed as supply lines stretched, as German mobile reserves counterattacked, as the spring thaw approached and turned the endless steppe into impassable mud. The red arrows on the map stopped growing, positions solidified. The front line stabilized 200 kilometers west of where it had been on February 7th. In the war room upstairs, staff officers spoke cautiously of Soviet offensive capability being exhausted, of German defensive skill proving decisive, of the situation being contained. In the basement, Steiner compiled different numbers. Soviet casualties estimated at 150,000. German casualties estimated at 80,000. Soviet territorial gains, 200 kilometers. German territorial losses, 200 kilometers. Soviet operational objective achieved, yes. German strategic position, compromised. "They traded casualties for space," Klaus said, reviewing the final assessment. "And they got what they wanted. More than that, they proved something." Steiner pulled out a file he'd been building since February 8th. Production data, the information that had been filtering through intelligence channels for months. Information most officers dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable. Soviet tank production 1942, 24,000 vehicles. Aircraft production, 37,000. Artillery production, 300,000 pieces. Personnel mobilization, 6 million. German equivalents, 9,000 tanks, 25,000 aircraft, 70,000 artillery pieces, 1.8 million personnel. "These are the numbers nobody wants to talk about," Steiner said, "because accepting them means accepting that we're fighting a different war than the one High Command planned for." Klaus studied the figures. Young enough to have been taught that German quality would always overcome Russian quantity. Old enough now, after 2 weeks on the Eastern Front, to understand what infinite quantity did to finite quality. "Sir, if these ratios are accurate, if they can replace losses at 2 or 3 times our rate, then it doesn't matter how many battles we win. The arithmetic is against us. We can achieve 3-to-1 kill ratios, which we often do, and still lose the attrition race because they can afford the losses and we can't." Silence in the basement. Upstairs, telephones rang, and staff officers pushed pins around maps and pretended the situation was manageable. Down here in the place where numbers lived, the truth sat quiet and patient and undeniable. "What do we do?" Klaus asked. "We document it. We report it. We make sure someone knows what's actually happening." Steiner stubbed out his cigarette. "And we hope that someone with the power to change things listens before the math becomes inevitable." But he'd been filing reports for 2 years, and he'd learned that hope, like assumptions, was a luxury the Eastern Front didn't permit. February 23rd brought news that changed the mathematics again. Kharkov, Ukraine's second-largest city, evacuated by German forces against Hitler's explicit orders. SS General Paul Richter had looked at his situation: Soviet armies closing from 3 sides, supply lines cut, the Stalingrad scenario playing out in miniature, and made the choice between survival and obedience. He chose survival. The news hit headquarters like a physical blow. Officers clustered in quiet groups, speaking in low voices about precedent and consequences. What Richter had done was simple mutiny, the kind of thing that ended with court-martials and firing squads. But he'd saved his corps, 30,000 men who would have been encircled and destroyed if he'd obeyed orders. Waldheim called a staff meeting that evening. Steiner and Klaus attended, sitting in the back, watching the field marshal explain the situation to his senior commanders. General Richter has been ordered to Berlin to explain his actions, Waldheim said carefully. However, given the outcome, the preservation of an intact combat formation, it's unlikely he'll face severe consequences. The precedent this sets is significant. Significant was diplomatic speak for catastrophic. Every German officer in the room understood the implications. If generals could retreat when encirclement threatened, if survival outweighed obedience, then Hitler's entire defensive strategy collapsed. The stand-fast orders that had been Germany's answer to Soviet numerical superiority, hold every position, defend every town, give nothing. That strategy only worked if commanders obeyed even when obedience meant death. But if commanders started choosing survival, started making tactical decisions based on reality instead of orders, then the whole system unraveled. Of course, if they didn't choose survival, they died. And dead commanders couldn't fight the next battle. The field marshal faces an interesting problem, Klaus observed quietly as they walked back to the office. Obey orders and lose armies. Disobey orders and lose control. It's not a new problem, Steiner said. It's just becoming impossible to ignore. March brought Waldheim's counteroffensive, the Third Battle of Kharkov, a masterpiece of mobile warfare that became the last great German victory in the East. Panzer reserves held back from the February fighting now unleashed against overextended Soviet spearheads. Encirclements, destructions, the kind of operational art that Waldheim excelled at. By mid-March, German forces had retaken Kharkov. In Berlin, propaganda celebrated the victory as proof that German arms could still triumph, that the February crisis had been temporary, that the Eastern Front remained manageable. Klaus shared the general optimism. He'd watched the operation unfold, seen the German tactical skill in action, watched Soviet tank corps get chopped to pieces by forces a third their size. Victory had a certain intoxication to it, a feeling that maybe the pessimistic numbers were wrong after all. Steiner didn't share the celebration. He spent March 20th compiling his assessment, the one nobody had asked for, but he wrote anyway because someone needed to understand what had actually happened. He finished it just after midnight. 11 pages of analysis that began with tactical appreciation and ended with strategic implications. He read it through once, made minor corrections, then filed it with his personal records. The last paragraph read, German forces achieved significant tactical success through operational excellence and Soviet overextension. However, strategic situation deteriorates. Soviet territorial gains, February-March 1943, 200 kilometers. German territorial gains, March 1943, 50 kilometers. Net Soviet advantage, 150 kilometers. More significantly, Soviet losses at Kharkov estimated at 3 tank corps, approximately 900 armored vehicles. German intelligence indicates Soviet tank production, January-March 1943, 6,000 vehicles. Soviet replacement rate, 8 days. Tactical victory achieved. Strategic position catastrophic. He closed the folder and found Klaus waiting at the door, holding 2 cups of coffee. Couldn't sleep either, the lieutenant asked. Sleep is for people who don't know what's coming. Steiner accepted the coffee. You should be celebrating. We won. Yes, sir. We won. Klaus sat down and Steiner could see he'd lost something in the past 6 weeks. The Academy Polish maybe, or the belief that winning battles meant winning wars. Sir, I've been going through the unit identifications from Kharkov. The Soviet formations we destroyed were reconstituted within 10 days. I know, I've been tracking it. How? How do they do that? Steiner opened his filing cabinet and withdrew the folder he'd been building since 1941. The production data, the statistical analysis, the mathematical portrait of a war machine that operated on principles German planning refused to acknowledge. He spread the key documents across his desk. Numbers in neat columns, graphs, tracking curves that all pointed the same direction, comparisons that made the tactical situation irrelevant. Soviet tank production, 1942, he began, pointing to one chart. 24,000 vehicles. Our production the same year, 9,000. Ratio, 2.7 to 1 in their favor. Klaus studied the numbers. But these can't be accurate. Soviet industry was devastated in 1941. They lost most of their Western manufacturing, They moved it. Entire factories disassembled and relocated east of the Urals. Rebuilt in Siberia, in the Urals, places our bombers can't reach. And they kept producing. Steiner pulled out another document. Soviet aircraft production 1942, 37,000. Our production, 25,000. Artillery pieces, they outproduce us 3-1. Small arms 4-1. But we destroy more of theirs than they destroy of ours. Our kill ratios don't matter. That's the point, Klaus. We can achieve 3-1, 4-1 kill ratios and still lose because they replace losses faster than we can inflict them. He pointed to another chart. Look at this. Stalingrad cost them approximately 500,000 casualties. Catastrophic by any measure. They replaced those losses in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Klaus set down his coffee cup carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile. Sir, if these numbers are real, if they're accurate, they are, then the war is already over. The arithmetic decides everything. We can't win an attrition fight at these ratios. No, we can't. The lieutenant sat in silence, absorbing implications that changed everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed about German superiority and inevitable victory. Does the field marshal know? He finally asked. I briefed him 2 hours ago, showed him everything. Steiner lit a cigarette, hands steady despite the weight of the conversation. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he said, these figures cannot be correct. Soviet production capacity is vastly overestimated in these reports. But you've triple-checked them. I've done more than triple-check. I've cross-referenced captured documents, prisoner interrogations, agent networks, photo reconnaissance, radio intercepts. Every source confirms the same basic picture. The Soviets are outproducing us by ratios we can't match, and the gap is widening. Klaus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. 24 years old, 6 weeks of real war behind him, and already understanding what it meant to see the end before it arrived. So we just keep fighting, knowing we can't win? We're soldiers, Lieutenant. We follow orders. We execute our missions. And we hope that someone above our rank has the wisdom to recognize mathematical reality before it becomes physical reality. Steiner tapped ash into a tray. But hope, I've learned, is not a strategy. Outside the basement window, the night was dark and cold. Somewhere in that darkness, across hundreds of miles of frozen steppe, Soviet factories were running 3 shifts, producing tanks and planes and artillery pieces that would arrive at the front in weeks or months, replacing losses, building reserves, creating the quantitative advantage that would eventually overwhelm any qualitative superiority German forces possessed. The numbers were patient, inevitable, uninterested in tactical brilliance or operational art. Sir, Klaus said quietly, you told me on my first day that February 8th was when my illusions would die. You were right, but I didn't expect. I thought war was about courage and skill and determination. It is. All of those things matter. They just don't matter enough when you're outnumbered 3-1 and the enemy can replace losses 3 times faster than you can. Steiner stubbed out his cigarette. Your father understood that. He saw it in the winter of 41. That's why he asked me to look after you, because he knew what was coming and didn't want you to die ignorant. He never told me the truth. He was trying to protect you. Parents do that. Steiner stood, moving to his map table. But you're here now. You've seen the numbers. You understand what they mean. The question is what you do with that understanding. Klaus joined him at the map. The situation display showed the current front line, the February gains now partially reversed by Waldheim's counteroffensive. It looked manageable, stable, the kind of map that suggested stalemate and negotiated peace might be possible. But the numbers told a different story. The numbers said this map was temporary, that the red line would keep moving west, slowly or quickly, but inevitably west, until it ran out of map and into Germany itself. What do I do? Klaus asked. What can any of us do? We document it. We make sure someone remembers what actually happened, not what the propaganda says happened. We tell the truth, even if no one wants to hear it. Steiner met the younger man's eyes. And we try to survive long enough to see how the story ends, even if we already know the ending. They worked through the rest of the night, updating files, cross-referencing reports, building the comprehensive record that Steiner believed might matter someday, when historians tried to understand how an army that won so many battles still lost the war. Dawn came slowly to southern Russia, gray light creeping through the basement window. Upstairs, the day shift would be arriving, fresh officers ready to push pins around maps and believe that today might bring the breakthrough that changed everything. Down here, where the numbers lived, Steiner and Klaus knew better. They'd seen February 8th. They'd counted the bodies and calculated the ratios. They'd done the arithmetic that no one wanted to see. And they'd learned that sometimes knowing the truth just meant watching it unfold with your eyes open. Documenting each step of the inevitable, waiting for someone with the power to change course to actually listen. But that morning, as the war entered its 20th month in the East, as Soviet factories continued their three-shift production schedules and German forces celebrated a tactical victory that changed nothing strategically, Steiner allowed himself one small moment of something that wasn't quite hope. Klaus was writing in his personal journal, the one Steiner had told him to keep, documenting his observations, recording the reality behind the official reports, learning to see the war as it was, not as anyone wanted it to be. One more witness, one more person who understood. It wasn't much, but in a war where truth was the first casualty and arithmetic the final judge, having one more person who could count accurately felt like something worth preserving. Even if the count kept getting higher and the numbers kept pointing toward an ending no one wanted to accept. Even then, Patterson shifted in his chair, the leather creaking. 6 hours had passed since the interrogation began. The afternoon had stretched into evening, and someone had brought in sandwiches that sat mostly untouched on the table between them. "The production ratios," Patterson said, consulting his notes. "You presented them to Field Marshal Waldheim in March 1943. 2-to-1 Soviet superiority in tanks, 3-to-1 in artillery, but the war continued another 2 years. What happened after Kharkov? When did the mathematics start becoming physical reality?" Steiner reached for his water glass. His voice had grown rougher over the hours of talking, the narrative pulling memories from places he'd kept carefully locked. "What happened next was Kursk, where we proved that tactical brilliance means nothing against material certainty, where Klaus learned what it feels like to be right for all the wrong reasons, where Germany committed suicide in slow motion over the course of 8 days." He opened another journal. July 1943, written on the cover in faded ink. This is where the arithmetic stopped being abstract. April 1943 brought rain and mud and the kind of operational pause that both sides needed, but only one could afford. The spring Rasputitsa turned the endless steppe into a sea of black mud that swallowed vehicles and made movement nearly impossible. The front line froze, not from cold, but from simple physics. Nothing could move through that mud. Steiner spent April in his basement office compiling data that made his March assessment look optimistic. Soviet losses February through March, estimated 400,000 casualties, 900 tanks, 1,500 aircraft. Catastrophic numbers that would have crippled most armies for a year. Soviet replacement rate, 6 weeks. By mid-April, intelligence reports indicated the destroyed units had been reconstituted, re-equipped, and moved back into line. New divisions appeared on the order of battle weekly. Fresh tank corps, guards rifle armies, artillery divisions that arrived at the front with full equipment complements and trained personnel. Klaus had taken to spending his evenings in the basement, helping Steiner compile the endless counts. The lieutenant had developed a talent for pattern recognition, spotting Soviet unit movements and organizational changes that suggested operational preparations weeks before official intelligence confirmed them. "Sir, the concentration around Kursk," Klaus pointed to the map on April 18th. "They're building something. Look at the rail traffic, the supply movements. This isn't defensive preparation." The Kursk salient bulged into German-held territory like a tumor, a 100-mile-deep Soviet-held pocket that disrupted the clean lines staff officers preferred on their maps. It was an obvious target, the kind of operational opportunity that German tactical doctrine said to exploit. Pinch off the salient, encircle the defending forces, restore the front line. High Command was already planning exactly that. Operation Citadel, the last great German offensive in the East. Steiner had been tracking the planning since late March, watching the buildup of German forces, the concentration of panzer divisions, the arrival of new tanks, Tigers and Panthers that were supposed to restore German technical superiority. He'd also been tracking Soviet preparations around Kursk, and what he saw made his assessment of Kharkov look naive. "They know," he said, studying Klaus's map annotations. "They know we're planning to attack Kursk, and they're preparing for it." "How can they know? Operational security has been absolute." "Lucy's spy ring in Switzerland. We've known about it for months, never shut it down completely. They're reading our communications, Klaus. They know the plan, probably know the timing, definitely know the axis of attack." Steiner pulled out a file of agent reports, signals intercepts, the accumulated evidence of a security failure that no one wanted to acknowledge. "Look at the defensive preparations. 8 defensive belts, mine density exceeding anything in military history, artillery concentrations that match our exact approach routes. This isn't defensive doctrine. This is specific preparation for our specific attack." Klaus studied the intelligence, cross-referencing Soviet unit positions with projected German approach routes. The pattern was undeniable. Every German avenue of advance channeled into prepared killing zones. Every likely breakthrough point pre-sighted by artillery. Every tactical option anticipated and countered. If they know everything, why don't we cancel the operation? Because admitting they know means admitting our security is compromised. And because High Command believes German tactical superiority can overcome defensive preparation. Steiner lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the stone ceiling. And because the Führer has ordered it, Citadel will proceed regardless of intelligence assessments, even if it's walking into a trap. Especially then, May brought a visitor to Army Group South headquarters, General Wilhelm Brandt, recently recalled from disgrace to serve as Inspector General of Panzer Forces. 44 years old, architect of armored warfare doctrine, the man who'd perfected the tactics that had nearly won the war in 1941 before Hitler relieved him of command for conducting an unauthorized retreat. Now he was back, tasked with rebuilding Germany's armored forces for the Kursk offensive. And unlike most officers at his level, Brandt understood arithmetic. Steiner met him in Waldheim's office on May 7th. The field marshal had arranged the meeting specifically because he knew what Brandt would say and wanted Steiner there to confirm it. Brandt didn't waste time on pleasantries. He spread production reports across Waldheim's desk with the blunt efficiency of a man presenting a terminal diagnosis. "Soviet tank production, 1942, he began. 24,000 vehicles. Our production, 9,000. Current year projections based on first quarter output. Soviets 30,000, Germany 12,000. The ratio is widening from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1. Waldheim studied the figures. These estimates have been disputed by people who don't want to believe them. Colonel Steiner, you've been tracking these numbers independently. What's your assessment?" "General Brandt's figures are conservative," Steiner said. "If anything, actual Soviet production may be higher. They're outbuilding us in every category. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, small arms. And unlike our production, which is being degraded by Allied bombing, theirs is concentrated in areas beyond our reach." Brandt nodded. "Which brings us to Citadel. High Command projects will commit approximately 3,000 tanks to the offensive. Intelligence estimates Soviet strength in the Kursk salient at 2,000 tanks. Favorable ratio, standard German tactical advantage. Except," he pulled out another document. "Colonel Steiner's latest assessment puts actual Soviet tank strength at closer to 5,000, and that's before reinforcements." Waldheim set down the report. "If your numbers are correct, we're attacking into numerical inferiority. That contradicts the entire operational concept." "The entire operational concept is flawed," Brandt said flatly. "Even if we achieve breakthrough, even if we encircle and destroy every Soviet unit in the Kursk salient, the strategic situation doesn't change. They'll replace their losses in weeks. We won't replace ours at all. We're gambling our last operational reserves on a tactical victory that buys us nothing strategically." "Then what do you recommend?" "Cancellation. Immediate shift to strategic defense. Trade space for time. Preserve our mobile forces. Seek negotiated settlement before the arithmetic becomes inevitable." Waldheim looked at Steiner. Your opinion? General Brandt is correct on every point. Citadel is strategically worthless, even if tactically successful. We should cancel, consolidate, defend. But, Steiner paused, the Führer has ordered the offensive. It will proceed regardless of our recommendations. Then we're watching a slow-motion disaster. Brandt stood gathering his documents. I'll present this assessment to High Command. They won't listen. But at least someone will have told them the truth before it happens. After he left, Waldheim sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he looked at Steiner. You were right about February, right about the production ratios, right about everything. Why do I keep hoping you're wrong? Because accepting I'm right means accepting we've already lost, and you're not ready to accept that yet. Are you? Steiner thought about Klaus, about Jakob, about all the young officers who kept arriving at the Eastern Front, believing in victory, in German superiority and clean endings. Thought about the numbers that kept growing, the ratios that kept widening, the arithmetic that pointed toward only one conclusion. I accepted it the morning of February 8th, he said. Everything since has just been tallying the cost. June brought delays. Hitler postponed Citadel repeatedly, waiting for more Panther tanks to arrive, more preparation, more certainty of success. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to strengthen their defenses, to bring up reinforcements, to perfect their preparations for an attack they knew was coming. Steiner watched the pattern with grim recognition. German planning assumed surprise, and speed would overcome Soviet defensive depth. But there was no surprise. The Soviets knew everything, and every day of delay made the operation less viable. Klaus had been promoted to captain, given command of an intelligence section supporting ex-Heat Panzer Corps. He still spent his evenings in Steiner's office, still helped compile the assessments that documented their slide toward catastrophe. The delays are killing us, he observed on June 20th. Every week, Soviet defensive strength increases by measurable amounts. At this rate, by July they'll have, he calculated quickly, close to 2 million men in the salient, maybe more. High Command estimates 1.3 million. Steiner added the number to his private assessment. Your figure is more accurate. They're systematically underestimating Soviet strength because accepting the real numbers means canceling the operation. Sir, I need to ask you something. Klaus set down his pencil. You've known since February that we're going to lose. You've documented everything, compiled evidence, briefed every officer who would listen. But you're still here, still filing reports, still counting. Why? It was a fair question. Steiner had asked himself the same thing during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the numbers ran through his head like accusations. Because someone has to remember what actually happened, he said finally. Not the propaganda version, not the heroic narrative where brave soldiers fought impossible odds. The real story, where we saw the truth and did nothing, where arithmetic decided everything, and we pretended we could overcome it with tactical skill and willpower. Someone has to document that for the history that comes after. Even if no one reads it, especially if no one reads it, because then at least one person knew. One person saw it clearly and wrote it down. That matters, Klaus. Maybe it's all that matters. The young captain nodded slowly. My father used to say something similar. That bearing witness was a duty even when it changed nothing. Your father was a wise man. I wish he'd survived to see you now. He'd be proud. Would he? I'm watching my country commit suicide and I can't stop it. All I can do is take notes while it happens. That's more than most people do. Most people don't want to see. They prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. You and I were stuck with the truth. It's not pleasant, but it's honest. Klaus returned to his calculations, updating Soviet strength estimates based on the latest intelligence. Young enough to still believe documentation mattered. Old enough now to understand that mattering and making a difference were not the same thing. July 5th, 1943. Operation Citadel began at dawn. Steiner was in the operations center when the first reports came in. German artillery preparation, the massive bombardment meant to soften Soviet defenses before the armor advance. Thousands of guns firing in coordinated patterns, walking shells across suspected Soviet positions. By 0700 hours, the first anomaly appeared. Forward observers reported the bombardment was hitting empty ground. The Soviet forward trenches had been evacuated. German shells were exploding in abandoned positions, while the actual Soviet defenders sat safely in their main defensive belts, waiting. They knew the timing, Klaus said, monitoring the reports from his section. They knew exactly when we'd fire and pulled back before the bombardment began. They've known everything from the beginning, Steiner replied. This is just confirmation. By Aero 900, German armor was advancing. Tigers and Panthers, the new tanks that were supposed to restore technical superiority, leading the assault. Behind them, regular panzer divisions and infantry. The full weight of German offensive power concentrated on a narrow front, and running straight into defenses that had been prepared specifically to stop them. The reports came in with a steady rhythm of catastrophe. Panzer divisions hit mine belts that channeled them into pre-sighted killing zones. Tigers that were nearly invulnerable from the front found themselves engaged from the sides by Soviet anti-tank guns, positioned specifically to target their weaker armor. Panthers broke down from mechanical problems faster than they were knocked out by enemy fire. German infantry following the armor died in the minefields, in the interlocking fields of machine gun fire, in the artillery barrages that had been pre-registered on every likely approach route. Klaus's unit was attached to Ex-Illinois Panzer Corps, positioned to exploit the breakthrough once German armor penetrated the Soviet defenses. He spent the first day of Citadel monitoring radio traffic, updating situation maps, watching the attack stall against defenses that shouldn't exist. By evening of July 5th, German forces had advanced approximately 6 kilometers. The operational plan had called for 30 kilometers on the first day. Klaus radioed Steiner at 2100 hours. His voice carried the flat exhaustion of a man who'd spent 12 hours watching a disaster unfold. Sir, my company went in with 18 tanks this morning. We have 6 operational. The rest are mine kills, mechanical breakdowns, or knocked out by anti-tank guns we never saw. The Panthers are useless. Half of them are broken down. The Tigers are effective, but there's only a handful, and they can't be everywhere. Casualties, infantry estimates 30% in my sector. Higher in some units. The Soviets have 8 defensive belts, sir. 8. We've penetrated 1. 7 more to go, and we're already combat ineffective. Steiner made notes, adding Klaus's report to the growing file of evidence that Operation Citadel was proceeding exactly as predicted. Exactly as the arithmetic said it would. Pull back if you can, he said. This isn't worth your life. Can't, sir. Orders are to continue the attack tomorrow. Fresh objectives, same defenses. We'll try again. The line went dead. Steiner sat in his basement office, surrounded by maps and casualty estimates and the careful documentation of a defeat that was still unfolding. Above him, in the operations center, staff officers were probably finding silver linings in the day's reports, talking about how first-day objectives always took longer than planned, how tomorrow would go better once they'd identified Soviet defensive patterns. Down here, Steiner knew better. The numbers were already written. Citadel would continue for days, maybe a week, grinding German forces down against defenses that regenerated faster than they could be overcome. Eventually, someone would recognize the arithmetic and cancel the offensive, but not before burning through the last of Germany's operational reserves. Not before Klaus and thousands like him paid the cost of strategic mistakes they hadn't made. July 12th. 1 week into Citadel, the operation had devolved into an attrition nightmare that made February's offensive look elegant by comparison. Klaus had survived the first week through luck and caution, rotating between forward positions in Corps headquarters, watching German tactical excellence get ground down by Soviet defensive doctrine refined through 2 years of bitter experience. That morning, Soviet Panzer Corps was committed to a final push toward the small town of Prokhorovka. Intelligence suggested one more effort, one more concentration of force, might achieve the breakthrough that had eluded German forces for 7 days. What intelligence didn't report, because German reconnaissance had missed it, was that Soviet Fifth Guard's tank army was already positioned around Prokhorovka. 800 tanks waiting. The Battle of Prokhorovka began at 08:30 hours and continued for 12 hours. It became the largest tank engagement in history. Over 1,500 armored vehicles colliding in a space of perhaps 10 square kilometers. a swirling chaos of steel and fire where tactical doctrine dissolved into pure violence. Klaus was there, commanding a support element, watching Tigers and Panthers and T-34s and KV-85s fight at ranges where technical advantages disappeared and crew training became the only edge. Watching Soviet tanks that were outgunned and outnumbered close to point-blank range where German armor superiority didn't matter. Watching them ram German tanks, fire into engine decks, sacrifice themselves in suicide charges that destroyed Tigers at the cost of 3 or 4 Soviet vehicles. He survived because his position was slightly behind the main engagement, close enough to see everything, far enough to not be in the immediate killing ground. By evening, the battlefield was a smoking graveyard. German forces had destroyed more Soviet tanks than they'd lost. The tactical exchange was favorable. The Germans had won. But when Klaus radioed his report to Steiner that night, his voice carried something beyond exhaustion, something that sounded like understanding arriving too late. "Sir, we destroyed them. We killed twice as many of their tanks as they killed of ours. By every tactical measure, we won today's engagement." But they kept coming. We'd knock out 1 tank and 2 more would appear. We'd destroy a company and a battalion would take its position. It didn't matter how many we killed. They just kept coming, and now my corps has lost 60% of its armor strength, and the Soviets are counterattacking with fresh units that weren't even at the battle. Steiner closed his eyes, listened to the exhaustion and comprehension in the young officer's voice. Klaus had just learned what Steiner had known since February, what the production reports had been saying for months, what the arithmetic had always indicated. Tactical victories were irrelevant when the enemy could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. "Where are those fresh units coming from?" Klaus asked. "We destroyed entire Soviet formations today. How do they have reserves already positioned to counterattack?" "The 160 divisions I warned about in April," Steiner said. "They weren't at Kursk. They were positioned around Kursk, waiting for us to exhaust ourselves. This was always the plan, Klaus. Let us attack their defenses, bleed us white, then counterattack with fresh forces we never knew existed." But our intelligence underestimated Soviet strength by at least 40%, because accepting the real numbers meant canceling the operation. So we attacked with incomplete intelligence into a prepared defense against an enemy who knew we were coming and had positioned forces specifically to counter our tactics. Silence on the line. Just the background hiss of radio static and distant explosions. Somewhere in that static, Klaus was processing the implications, understanding that Prokhorovka wasn't an aberration, it was the future. Every battle from here forward would follow the same pattern. German tactical excellence producing favorable exchange ratios that meant nothing strategically because the Soviets could afford the losses and Germany couldn't. "Sir," Klaus said finally, "are we going to lose this war?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Steiner had known the answer since February 8th, had documented the arithmetic, compiled the evidence, briefed every officer who would listen. But hearing Klaus ask it, hearing the comprehension in his voice, made the answer feel different, more real, more final. "Yes," Steiner said, "we're going to lose. The only question now is how many die before everyone else accepts what the numbers have already proven." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Klaus spoke again, his voice steady now. Professional. The voice of a soldier who just had his last illusion burned away in the smoke of Prokhorovka. "Then I'd better make sure I survive to see the ending. Someone needs to remember what actually happened here. That's the spirit, Captain. Stay alive. Document everything. We'll need witnesses when this is over." The radio clicked off. Steiner sat in his basement office, adding Klaus's report to the growing file on Citadel. Above him, the operations center was probably still analyzing the day's fighting, looking for advantages to exploit, planning tomorrow's operations. Down here, Steiner was tallying the cost. German tank losses at Prokhorovka, approximately 300 vehicles. Soviet losses, estimated 700. Favorable ratio, tactical success. Strategically meaningless because Soviet tank production that week would replace their losses. German production wouldn't replace theirs. The arithmetic was patient, inexorable, uninterested in tactical brilliance. July 13th, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel, not because of Prokhorovka, though that battle had made the situation clear, because on July 12th, the same day as Prokhorovka, Soviet forces had launched Operation Kutuzov, a massive counteroffensive 200 kilometers north, striking General Model's Ninth Army in the rear. The 160 divisions Steiner had warned about, the reserves that German intelligence had failed to detect or refused to believe existed. They weren't phantom formations. They were real, and they were attacking while German forces were still locked in combat at Kursk. The pattern was brutally simple. Let Germany exhaust its offensive power against prepared defenses, then counterattack with fresh forces positioned specifically for that purpose. Tactical defense leading to operational offense. Soviet operational art refined through 2 years of bitter lessons. Waldheim called a conference on July 14th. Senior staff only. Closed doors. The kind of meeting where uncomfortable truths could be spoken without witnesses. Steiner attended with his compiled assessments. Brandt was there, having flown in from high command. Klaus stood against the back wall, taking notes, bearing witness. Citadel has been canceled, Waldheim began without preamble. Total casualties approximately 54,000. Tank losses approximately 700 vehicles. We've achieved penetration of 12 kilometers against Soviet defenses. We've destroyed an estimated 3 Soviet tank corps and inflicted 150,000 casualties. He set down the official report. Now someone tell me what actually happened. Brandt spoke first. We lost. Tactically, we traded favorably. Strategically, we achieved nothing except the destruction of our last mobile reserves. The Soviets are now counterattacking on multiple axes. We lack the strength to contain them. The strategic initiative has passed to the Red Army and will not return. Waldheim looked at Steiner. Your assessment? Steiner opened his folder. 7 days of compiled data. Soviet tank production last week, approximately 500 vehicles. Our production, approximately 200 vehicles. They replaced their Kursk losses in 10 days. We won't replace ours at all because we don't have 10 days. Soviet forces are advancing in the north and will shortly begin offensives in the south. Every formation we committed to Citadel is now needed for defensive operations. We traded our operational reserve for a tactical victory that lasted 8 days. Can we stop their counteroffensives? No, sir. Not without mobile reserves, which we just destroyed at Kursk. We can conduct fighting withdrawals, trade space for time, try to establish defensible positions, but we can't stop them. The arithmetic doesn't permit it. Silence in the room. Officers studying maps, calculating distances, running scenarios that all ended the same way. Retreat, regroup, retreat again, the pattern that would define the next 2 years. Klaus spoke from the back of the room, his voice quiet but clear. Sir, request permission to speak. Waldheim nodded. I was at Prokhorovka. I watched us destroy twice as many of their tanks as we lost. It felt like victory right up until their reinforcements arrived, and we realized we'd been fighting their covering force while their main strength was positioned to counterattack. That's when I understood. They're not fighting the same war we're fighting. We're trying to win battles. They're trying to exhaust us, and they're succeeding. He closed his notebook. Colonel Steiner has been right about everything. The production ratios, the Soviet capabilities, the strategic implications. We should have listened in February. We should have canceled Citadel. We didn't. And now we're going to pay for that mistake in blood and kilometers for the next... How long, sir? How long until we run out of both? Steiner met the young captain's eyes across the room, saw Jakob in that gaze, saw the son who'd survived while the father hadn't, saw a witness who would remember. 2 years, Steiner said quietly. Maybe less if we're unlucky. Maybe more if we're very, very good at losing slowly. The meeting concluded with orders to prepare defensive positions, to husband resources, to make the Soviets pay for every kilometer. Professional military practice applied to a situation that professional military practice couldn't solve. Afterward, Brandt pulled Steiner aside in the hallway. You've been documenting all of this? Everything. Production data, casualty figures, operational assessments. The complete record of how we knew we were losing and fought anyway. Keep doing it. When this is over, when someone tries to write the history, they'll need evidence that we saw it coming. that it wasn't just Hitler's madness or bad luck, that the arithmetic decided everything and we chose to ignore it. You think anyone will care? Someone will. Historians, strategists, future generals who need to understand how numerical superiority and production capacity determine outcomes regardless of tactical skill. Your records will matter. Maybe not soon, but eventually. Brandt left to return to Berlin to brief high command on assessments they wouldn't accept, to recommend strategic adjustments they wouldn't implement, doing his duty with the grim awareness that duty wasn't enough. Steiner returned to his basement office and found Klaus waiting. "Sir, I need to know something. You've been counting since February, documenting everything, briefing commanders who don't listen. Why? What's the point if nothing changes?" Steiner sat heavily in his chair. 52 years old, 22 months on the Eastern Front, and the weight of all those months settled on him like lead. Because 20 years from now, someone is going to ask what we knew and when we knew it. They're going to ask if we saw this coming, if we could have stopped it, if we chose to keep fighting even after the outcome was mathematically determined. He pulled out his journals, months of careful documentation. These will answer those questions, not with propaganda or heroic narratives, with numbers, with evidence, with the truth that no one wanted to hear. And if no one ever reads them, then at least I'll know I tried, that I saw the truth and wrote it down, that I didn't lie to myself or anyone else about what was happening. Sometimes that's all you can do, Klaus. Bear witness, document the disaster. Hope that someday someone learns something from it. Klaus nodded slowly. Then I'll help. I'll document everything from my level. What it looks like from the front. How the decisions you track in reports translate to men dying in minefields. Between your strategic assessments and my tactical observations, maybe we'll create a complete record. Your father would approve. He believed in truth even when truth was ugly. Did it help him? Believing in truth? It made him honest. Sometimes that's all we get. They worked through the night, updating files, cross-referencing reports, building the comprehensive record that would survive even if they didn't. Outside, across hundreds of miles of front line, Soviet forces were preparing the offensives that would commence in days. Operations Rumyantsev and Polkovodets. Rumyantsev, the hammer blows that would shatter German defenses south of Kursk and begin the long push west. By dawn on July 15th, Steiner had completed his assessment of Citadel, 23 pages of analysis that began with operational planning and ended with strategic consequences. The final paragraph read, "Operation Citadel achieved tactical objectives within limited parameters while failing catastrophically at operational and strategic levels. German forces demonstrated continued excellence in mobile warfare and tactical adaptation. However, fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet material superiority and operational doctrine rendered tactical skill irrelevant. Soviet ability to replace losses 3 times faster than German forces can inflict casualties creates mathematical inevitability of defeat through attrition. Strategic initiative lost. Will not be recovered. Recommend immediate shift to strategic defense and negotiated settlement while leverage remains. Assessment will be ignored." He filed it with his other reports, the ones that documented truth no one wanted to accept. 3 days later, Soviet forces launched Operation Rumyantsev toward Kharkov, the city that Waldheim had retaken in March, that had been celebrated as proof of German resilience, fell to Soviet forces on August 23rd. This time there would be no counteroffensive to retake it. This time, it was lost for good. Klaus was reassigned in late August, his intelligence section transferred to support operations in the Donbass. September and October brought the cascading collapse Steiner had predicted in July. Soviet offensives across the entire southern front, the Donbass evacuated, the Dnieper River line breached, Kiev liberated on November 6th, exactly 2 years after it had fallen in 1941. The front line moved west with the steady rhythm of mathematical certainty. German forces fought well, conducted professional defensive operations, inflicted casualties at favorable ratios. None of it mattered. The Soviets absorbed losses and kept coming, replaced destroyed units, and attacked again. Operated on principles of mass and momentum that rendered German tactical excellence strategically irrelevant. Steiner documented it all. The numbers growing larger, the ratios widening, the mathematical proof accumulating that Germany was being ground down by an enemy it had never truly understood. In November, he received new intelligence that changed his calculations in ways that made previous assessments look conservative. Soviet production figures for 1943: 24,000 tanks, 34,000 aircraft, 300,000 artillery pieces. German production the same year: 12,000 tanks, 25,000 aircraft, 70,000 artillery pieces. Every category, Soviet superiority had widened from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 or worse. And Soviet production was still increasing while German production struggled under Allied bombing campaigns that were systematically destroying manufacturing capacity. He compiled the data into a report dated November 15, 1943, 27 pages of statistical analysis that concluded, current loss rates and production differentials indicate German military collapse inevitable within 18 to 24 months. No tactical or operational adjustment can overcome 3-to-1 material inferiority when enemy possesses equivalent or superior operational doctrine. Recommend immediate armistice negotiations before mathematical certainty becomes physical reality. Recommendation will be ignored. He was right about that too. December brought winter and a request from Berlin. General Brandt, now Chief of the General Staff, wanted to see Steiner's complete records. All of them. The comprehensive documentation of Germany's slide toward defeat. Steiner traveled to Berlin in late December, carrying 3 years of journals, reports, and statistical analyses. The city looked different than he remembered. Bombed, rebuilt, bombed again. The physical manifestation of a war that was consuming everything. He met Brandt in a private office, away from the headquarters staff and the officers who still believed in miracle weapons in turning the tide. "I need truth," Brandt said without preamble. "Not optimistic projections, not best-case scenarios. Truth. How long do we have?" Steiner opened his case and withdrew the summary he'd prepared. 6 months of work condensed into 50 pages of brutal honesty. Based on current attrition rates, Soviet offensive capabilities, and production differentials, Germany will be pushed back to approximately the 1941 invasion start line by spring 1944. Soviet summer offensive will likely achieve breakthrough into Poland. By end of 1944, Soviet forces will reach East Prussia. By spring 1945, Berlin. Brandt read the assessment in silence. When he finished, he looked older. 18 months. We have 18 months before Soviet forces reach German soil. That's the optimistic timeline. It assumes we fight perfectly, that Soviet offensives encounter unexpected difficulties, that nothing catastrophic happens. Realistic timeline is 12 to 15 months. Can anything change this? Armistice, immediate. Negotiate from whatever position we still hold. Preserve what we can before the Soviets take everything. Hitler will never agree. I know. Brandt stood, moved to the window overlooking the damaged city. I want to present your findings to the Führer. I want him to see the arithmetic, to understand that this isn't defeatism or pessimism. It's just numbers. He'll have you shot. Probably, but I have to try. Someone has to tell him that courage and willpower can't overcome 3-to-1 material inferiority. That wars are won by factories and railroads as much as by soldiers and tanks. When? January. I'll compile your data into a comprehensive briefing, present it to Hitler and the High Command. Make them look at the numbers they've been ignoring for 2 years. Steiner left Berlin that evening, returning to the Eastern Front with the grim certainty that Brandt's briefing would fail. That mathematical truth was no match for ideological certainty, that they would keep fighting until the numbers became physical reality and Soviet armies stood in the streets of Berlin. He was right about that, too. The year 1943 ended with German forces back to approximately their June 1941 positions. 2.5 years of fighting, millions of casualties, and they were back where they'd started, except now defending instead of attacking, retreating instead of advancing, counting days instead of planning victories. On December 31st, Steiner sat in his office and compiled his annual summary, a document no one had requested, but he wrote anyway because someone needed to remember. Year 1943, German forces retreated approximately 800 kilometers. Casualties, 1.2 million. Soviet casualties estimated at 2.8 million. Favorable exchange ratio of 1.2.3 maintained throughout year. Strategically irrelevant as Soviet replacement rate exceeded German casualties by factor of 3 to 1. Eastern Front entered state of permanent retreat. Mathematical projection. War lost by mid-1945. Political reality. War will continue beyond mathematical conclusion until physical collapse. Estimated additional casualties before acceptance of inevitable. 2 to 3 million German military, unknown millions of Soviet military and civilian populations. Arithmetic proved conclusive. Psychology proved determinative. We know we are losing. We will continue fighting. Documentation complete for year 1943. He closed the journal and filed it with the others. 3 years of careful record-keeping. 3 years of bearing witness to a catastrophe everyone could see but few would acknowledge. Somewhere in the winter darkness, Klaus was serving with his unit in the defensive lines. Waldheim was commanding his sector, executing brilliant tactical operations that changed nothing strategically. Brandt was in Berlin, preparing his briefing, readying his argument that arithmetic should overcome ideology. And the war ground on, consuming men and material and futures with the patient efficiency of a machine that operated on principles of production and logistics and replacement rates. The numbers were patient. The numbers were honest. The numbers pointed toward an ending that everyone could calculate but no one in power would accept. Steiner added one more line to his December summary, a personal note that wasn't quite professional but felt necessary. Note to future historians, we knew. All of us knew. The question you will ask is why we kept fighting. The answer is that knowing and being able to act on that knowledge are different things. We were trapped between mathematical certainty and political reality. We chose to document the former while dying for the latter. Remember that when you judge us. We saw the truth clearly. We just couldn't stop the machine. He closed the journal, turned off his lamp, and sat in the darkness of his basement office, listening to the winter wind and thinking about Klaus and Jacob and all the young men who died believing in something while the numbers proved otherwise. Tomorrow would bring more reports, more casualties, more evidence that they were losing. Tomorrow and every day after until the arithmetic stopped being abstract and became the physical presence of Soviet armies on German soil. But tonight, Steiner allowed himself one moment of something that wasn't quite despair and wasn't quite hope. Just the quiet certainty that he had done what he could. Documented the truth, borne witness, tallied the cost. Sometimes that was all anyone could do. Sometimes it had to be enough. Patterson leaned forward, studying Steiner's face in the harsh fluorescent light. The colonel's voice had grown hoarser over the hours, the narrative wearing him down in ways the war hadn't quite managed. 1944, Patterson said carefully. General Brandt's briefing to Hitler. You mentioned it failed. What happened? And when did the mathematics you'd been projecting start to accelerate? Steiner's hands tightened on the table edge, the only visible sign of tension. When he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, not the analytical tone of an intelligence officer reciting data, but something harder. The voice of a man who'd tried to change history and watched it continue regardless. What happened in 1944 is we tried. Brandt tried. Waldheim tried. I tried. We failed. He pulled out a thicker journal, the cover more worn than the others. And Klaus learned what it costs when you try to stop a machine and the machine doesn't stop. January 1944 brought rain to Ukraine and mathematical certainty to German planning rooms. The offensive capability that had characterized German operations since 1939 no longer existed. The mobile reserves had been consumed at Kursk. The Panzer divisions existed on paper, but fielded company-strength formations at best. The Luftwaffe still flew, but couldn't achieve air superiority against Soviet numerical advantages that now approached 5 to 1. Steiner spent January compiling his assessment for Brandt's briefing to Hitler. The briefing that everyone knew would fail, but someone had to attempt anyway, because the alternative was accepting that truth didn't matter, that arithmetic couldn't overcome ideology, that they would keep fighting until physical collapse made fighting impossible. The summary he prepared was 32 pages of statistical analysis backed by 3 years of documentation. Soviet production 1943, 24,000 tanks. German production, 12,000. Soviet aircraft, 34,000. German aircraft, 25,000. In every category, Soviet superiority had widened from 2 to 1 to approaching 3 to 1. More critically, Soviet operational doctrine had evolved. The crude mass attacks of 1941 had been replaced by sophisticated deep operations that matched or exceeded German operational art. Coordinated breakthroughs, exploitation by mobile groups, encirclement operations. The Soviets had learned German tactics, adapted them, and in many cases improved them. "They're not the same army we invaded," Steiner wrote in his covering assessment. "They've absorbed our doctrine, matched our operational tempo, and overcome it through material superiority we cannot counter." Tactical excellence remains high on both sides. Strategic outcome determined by production capacity and replacement rates. Current ratios make German defeat mathematically inevitable within 12 to 18 months absent negotiated settlement. Brandt presented the briefing on January 28th. Steiner wasn't there. Junior colonels didn't attend meetings with the Führer, but he received Brandt's report that evening. Hitler had listened to the production figures, reviewed the casualty projections, studied the maps showing Soviet advances. Then he dismissed the entire analysis as defeatist thinking. German quality would overcome Russian quantity. New weapons were in development. The Allied coalition would fracture. Victory remained possible for those with sufficient will. Brandt had pressed, presented the arithmetic again, argued that willpower couldn't change numbers. Hitler had thanked him for his candor and suggested that pessimistic officers might be better suited to administrative positions far from the front. "He didn't have me shot," Brandt told Steiner by phone that night. "Worse. He smiled and ignored everything I said, as if mathematical proof was just an opinion he could choose not to accept." What now? Now we fight the war we're losing as professionally as possible. Preserve what we can. Try to survive long enough to see the ending we already know is coming. "How long do you think we have?" Silence on the line. Then Brandt's voice quiet and certain. 18 months if we're lucky, 12 if we're not. Soviet summer offensive will break through to Poland. By winter, East Prussia. By spring 45, Berlin. The arithmetic is absolutely clear. Does anyone else in high command understand this? They all understand it. They just can't admit it because admitting defeat means accepting responsibility for what comes after. So they'll keep fighting, keep hoping for miracles, keep sending boys to die for kilometers of frozen mud that don't matter strategically. The line went dead. Steiner sat in his office, surrounded by 3 years of documentation that proved everything Brandt had just said. Proof that meant nothing. Truth that changed nothing. Numbers that pointed toward an ending everyone could see but no one in power would acknowledge. He updated his journal with Brandt's report, added it to the growing file of evidence that Germany's leadership had chosen ideological certainty over mathematical reality. Then he returned to his routine work. Casualty reports, intelligence summaries, the daily documentation of a war that was being lost 1 kilometer at a time. March brought Klaus back to headquarters, promoted to major, given command of an intelligence battalion, supporting Army Group South's defensive operations. 25 years old now, with the bearing of someone who'd aged a decade in 2 years. He found Steiner in the basement office on March 15th. "Sir, I heard about General Brandt's briefing, that Hitler dismissed the production figures." He did. But the numbers are undeniable. Even if you doubt the absolute accuracy, the trends are clear. We're being outproduced 3 to 1 in every category. The Führer believes German will and superior tactics can overcome material disadvantage. Klaus sat down heavily. "Sir, I've been on the front for 18 months. I've watched our kill ratios improve even as our strategic position collapsed. We're achieving 3 to 1, sometimes 4 to 1 casualty exchanges, and it doesn't matter. They just keep coming. Fresh divisions, new equipment, endless reserves. We destroy them, and they're replaced within weeks. It's mathematically unsustainable." "I know. Then why are we still fighting?" It was the question Steiner had been asking himself since February 1943, the question that had no good answer, only honest ones. Because surrendering requires someone with authority to choose reality over ideology, and everyone with that authority has chosen otherwise. He pulled out his latest assessment. Because soldiers follow orders even when orders are mathematically absurd. because we're trapped between what we know and what we're permitted to do about it. Klaus picked up the assessment, scanned the summary. 12 to 18 months until Soviet forces reached German territory. You've been saying this since Kursk. It keeps proving accurate. When will someone listen? When it's too late to matter, when Soviet armies are physically standing in Berlin and mathematical projections become observed reality? That's insane. Yes, but it's also the situation we're in. So we document it, we fight as professionally as we can, and we try to survive long enough to bear witness to the ending. Klaus was silent for a moment. Then, "Sir, I need you to know something. My father's last letter, the one that arrived after he was killed, he wrote about you, about how you were the only officer he knew who saw the war clearly, who understood that courage and skill weren't enough against overwhelming material superiority. He asked me to find you if anything happened to him, to learn from you. I know he wrote me too, asked me to look after you. You have. You've taught me to see clearly, to understand the difference between tactical success and strategic reality, to recognize when arithmetic determines outcomes regardless of will or skill." Klaus met his eyes. "I just wish that clarity changed something, that seeing the truth had some practical value beyond documentation. It does. 20 years from now, when historians try to understand how this happened, they'll need evidence that we saw it coming, that we weren't blind or stupid, just trapped. Your observations from the front and my statistical analyses will show that we understood what was happening even as we were powerless to stop it. Is that enough? Documentation for future historians? It's what we have. Sometimes that has to be enough." They worked through the night, updating intelligence summaries, correlating frontline reports with strategic assessments, building the comprehensive record that would survive even if they didn't. June 1944 brought two hammer blows that shattered German strategic assumptions permanently. June 6th, Allied landing at Normandy. Germany now faced the two-front war that every strategic planner had nightmared about since 1939. Western allies pushing from France, Soviet armies grinding forward in the east, and finite German resources stretched between threats that were individually overwhelming and collectively catastrophic. Steiner compiled the arithmetic within hours of the Normandy news. German forces in the west, approximately 60 divisions. Allied forces in Normandy theater, estimated to reach 80 divisions within 60 days. German forces in the east, approximately 190 divisions. Soviet forces on Eastern Front, estimated at 400 divisions with another 100 in reserve. The numbers were stark. Germany was outnumbered 2-1 in the west, 2-1 in the east, and lacked operational reserves to respond to breakthrough in either theater. "We can't win a two-front war at these odds," he wrote in his June 7th assessment. "Cannot be done. Mathematical impossibility. Either front individually would strain German capacity. Both simultaneously exceeds all possible capability. Strategic defeat now inevitable on accelerated timeline. Revised estimate. Soviet forces reached German border by December 1944, not spring 1945 as previously projected. Normandy landing advances defeat schedule by approximately 4 months. The second blow came June 22nd, Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive that Steiner had been predicting since April. The massive assault that Soviet intelligence had concealed through elaborate deception operations. The attack that German high command had convinced itself would come in Ukraine, because Ukraine made strategic sense, protecting Romanian oil, rather than in Belarus, where Soviet forces had been secretly concentrating for months. Steiner had warned about Belarus. His intelligence summaries in April and May had documented the Soviet buildup. Troop movements, supply concentrations, all the indicators of offensive preparation. High command had dismissed the evidence as deception, assuming the main blow would fall elsewhere. They were catastrophically wrong. Operation Bagration began at dawn on June 22nd, exactly 3 years after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Soviet artillery bombardment of such intensity that entire German divisions ceased to exist as organized units within hours. Partisan attacks that cut every communication line throughout Belarus, leaving German commanders blind, unable to coordinate, unable to respond. Then breakthrough. Soviet tank armies punching through shattered defenses, racing into German rear areas, encircling entire corps before they could retreat. Deep operations doctrine executed with precision that matched anything Germany had achieved in 1941. Steiner monitored the disaster from his office, compiling reports that read like descriptions of Germany's own tactics being used against them, with overwhelming material superiority backing each move. Week 1, 12 German divisions destroyed, Soviet advances of 40 kilometers per day in some sectors. Army Group Center losing coherence, fragmenting into isolated pockets. Week 2, 28 German divisions completely eliminated, more than Stalingrad. Soviet forces advancing 350 kilometers in 14 days, faster than German advances in 1941. Week 3, Minsk liberated. Soviet armies approaching the Vistula River, Poland within reach. Army Group Center ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. By mid-July, the arithmetic were undeniable even to the most optimistic assessments. German casualties in Bagration, more than 300,000. 28 divisions destroyed, 17 more rendered combat ineffective. The entire center of the Eastern Front had collapsed. Klaus had been attached to Army Group Center in early June, an intelligence liaison assignment that should have been routine. He survived Bagration through luck and the kind of tactical skill that kept soldiers alive in catastrophe. Made it back to friendly lines on July 5th after 9 days behind Soviet lines. Radio dead. Maps obsolete. Navigating by dead reckoning and desperation. He reached Steiner's headquarters on July 8th, filthy, exhausted, carrying reports that made the official casualty estimates look conservative. "Sir," he stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. "Major Weber reporting." Steiner looked up from his casualty compilation and saw Jakob, saw his friend 30 years younger, aged by combat into something harder and more weathered, saw the cost of Bagration written in every line of the younger man's face. "Sit down before you fall down." Klaus sat. Steiner poured water from his canteen, passed it over, watched the young major drink with the desperate thirst of someone who'd spent days drinking from mud puddles and shell craters. "Your report," Steiner said quietly. "When you're ready." Klaus set down the canteen, pulled out a stained notebook, began reciting observations in the flat monotone of someone describing atrocity so enormous that emotion became impossible. "Army Group Center is gone. Not defeated. Gone. 28 divisions eliminated completely. I watched it happen. Soviet artillery preparation was beyond anything I'd seen before. More guns per kilometer than at Kursk. It didn't just suppress our positions. It obliterated them. Entire battalions ceased to exist before the ground assault began." He turned pages in his notebook. "Then breakthrough. Soviet tank armies moving faster than our retreating infantry. They'd position forces behind us, cut retreat routes, encircle entire corps. We'd wake up surrounded by enemies who'd move 50 kilometers overnight. Our operational tempo, the advantage we'd held since 1939, they've matched it, exceeded it, beaten us with our own doctrine backed by material superiority we can't counter. Casualties in your sector. My unit went into Bagration with 800 men. I brought out 73. Klaus closed the notebook. "Sir, you've been right about everything. The production ratios, the Soviet capabilities, the mathematical inevitability. I've watched it become physical reality. We're not losing battles, we're losing the war. And everyone on the front knows it even if high command won't admit it." Steiner made notes, adding Klaus's observations to his Bagration file. First-hand testimony from someone who'd survived the catastrophe. Evidence for the historical record. "The Führer's response to Bagration," he said carefully, "was to order that every foot of ground be held, that commanders who retreat without permission face court-martial." Klaus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sir, I retreated 300 kilometers in 2 weeks, not by choice, because staying meant dying surrounded. Half the officers who obeyed stand-fast orders are dead or captured. The other half learned that survival requires tactical judgment that sometimes contradicts strategic orders. That's mutiny. That's reality. You can execute every officer who retreats, or you can lose every officer who doesn't. Pick one." Klaus stood, steadier now. "Sir, Permission to ask a question outside proper channels? Granted. How much longer? You've been tracking the arithmetic since 43. You predicted Bagration would break through to Poland. You've been right about timeline and magnitude. So tell me, how much longer do we have? Steiner pulled out his latest projection, updated after Normandy and Bagration. The arithmetic that had become his constant companion, his burden, his responsibility to bear and document. Soviet forces will reach East Prussia by December. Warsaw will fall within weeks. It's already encircled. By January, Soviet armies will cross into Germany. By March, they'll reach the Oder River. By April, Berlin. He met Klaus's eyes. 10 months, maybe less. That's how long we have. And high command? Still planning counteroffensives, still believing in miracle weapons, still refusing to accept that arithmetic determines outcomes regardless of will. Klaus was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sir, I need to go back. My battalion needs reconstitution, new assignment. I'll probably be sent to East Prussia or Poland. Defensive operations. Delaying actions." He paused. "If I don't make it back, and statistically, I probably won't, I want you to know. You made a difference. You taught me to see clearly, to understand that truth matters even when it can't change the outcome. My father would have appreciated that." Steiner stood, extended his hand, felt the calluses, the strength, the vitality of a young officer who'd survived 2 years on the Eastern Front through skill and luck that couldn't last forever. "Keep counting, Major. Document everything. If you survive and I don't, someone needs to tell this story honestly." "I'll do my best. You keep tallying, sir. Make sure the final numbers are accurate." Klaus left. Steiner watched him climb the stairs, wondering if that was the last time. Wondering how many more young officers would pass through his basement office before the arithmetic became complete, before the counting was finished. He returned to his Bagration assessment, added Klaus's testimony to the evidence file, then updated his projection model with the new data. Original timeline. Soviet armies reach Berlin, spring 1945. Post-Bagration timeline. Soviet armies reach Berlin, April 1945, possibly earlier. The arithmetic was accelerating. Each German defeat shortened the timeline, brought the ending closer, not because Soviet operational skill was improving, though it was, but because German capacity to resist was eroding faster than replacement rates could restore. August brought Romania's surrender and switch to the Allied side. The Plosti oil fields, source of 60% of German petroleum, lost overnight. Without fuel, panzer divisions became static defense positions. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe flew reduced sortie rates. Without fuel, the mobile warfare that had characterized German operations became impossible. Steiner updated his assessment. Loss of Romanian oil reduces German operational mobility by estimated 60%. Strategic reserve of mechanized forces rendered largely immobile. Defensive operations will increasingly depend on static defense and limited local counterattacks. Soviet operational advantage, already overwhelming due to material superiority, now compounded by German mobility deficit. Revised timeline. Oder River reached by February 1945, not March as previously projected. The arithmetic kept accelerating. Each loss compounded previous losses. Each defeat made the next defeat more likely, faster, more complete. September and October passed in cascading retreat. Poland, the country Germany had invaded in 1939 to start this war, was being overrun by Soviet forces that advanced with a speed that made German 1939 operations look pedestrian. The Vistula River, Warsaw, Krakow, names from the beginning of the war now appearing in casualty reports that documented the ending. Steiner worked 20-hour days compiling reports that nobody read, documentation that nobody acted on, evidence that would matter only after everything was over, and historians tried to understand how a nation fought to total destruction rather than accept mathematical reality. December brought news that changed his timeline again. The Vistula-Oder offensive was being prepared. Soviet intelligence indicated the attack would come in January, not spring, as German planning assumed. Another massive operation, this one aimed directly at Germany itself. Steiner calculated probable timelines based on Soviet operational patterns from Bagration. If they achieved similar penetration rates, and there was no reason to think they wouldn't, Soviet forces would reach the Oder River by early February, within 50 miles of Berlin. He compiled the projection on December 20th, 1944. 23 pages of analysis that concluded, Soviet offensive, January 1945, will penetrate to Oder River within 3 weeks. German defensive capability insufficient to prevent breakthrough. Estimated timeline to Berlin, April 1945. Total German collapse by May. These projections assume continued resistance at current effectiveness levels. Projections may prove optimistic. The last sentence was as close as Steiner came to acknowledging what everyone on the Eastern Front understood, but few would speak aloud. German defensive effectiveness was declining. While units were increasingly composed of teenagers and old men with minimal training. Equipment was becoming scarce. Ammunition, fuel, even basic supplies were growing difficult to obtain. The entire system was fraying, but they kept fighting, kept following orders, kept dying for objectives that had no strategic value because stopping required admitting defeat, and no one with authority would permit that admission. November brought another meeting, this one that Steiner had not anticipated. Brandt requested his presence in a location outside normal channels. A farmhouse 30 kilometers from headquarters, isolated, no staff, no aides, no witnesses. When Steiner arrived on the evening of December 1st, he found not just Brandt but Waldheim as well, and Klaus, who'd been recalled from the front for reasons that hadn't been explained. 4 men around a table in a room lit by kerosene lamps, the kind of meeting that didn't exist in official records. Brandt spoke first, his voice low but steady. July 20th plot failed, 5,000 officers executed, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to end this. Waldheim looked older than his 58 years, the weight of 2 years of defensive operations etched into his face. You're proposing what exactly? Coup. Remove Hitler. Negotiate immediate armistice with Western allies. Surrender before Soviet armies reach German soil. That's treason. That's arithmetic. We've lost. Continuing to fight costs 10,000 German lives per day. For what? To delay the inevitable by weeks? Steiner had brought his latest projection. Spread it on the table. If we surrender now, December 1st, Soviet forces halt at current positions, approximately 200 kilometers from German border. If we continue fighting, Soviet armies reach Berlin by April. Additional casualties before surrender. Estimated 500,000 German military, unknown millions of Soviet and civilian. Klaus studied the projection, his young face grave with understanding beyond his years. Sir, the Gestapo has informants everywhere. This conversation alone is death sentence if reported. I know, but someone has to try. Brandt looked at each of them. Waldheim, you have field command. Steiner, you have documentation proving the war is lost. Klaus, you represent the next generation, the officers who will survive to rebuild. Together we approach the Western allies, present our evidence, negotiate terms. Silence. The weight of what was being proposed settling on them like snow that would eventually bury everything. Waldheim spoke slowly, each word measured. I've obeyed orders for 30 years, sworn oaths. Even when orders were strategically insane, I followed them because that's what soldiers do. And those orders have killed 4 million Germans for a war the arithmetic proves we lost 2 years ago. I know. Waldheim's voice broke slightly. I've known since Kursk, maybe earlier, but knowing and acting are different things. Steiner felt the moment crystallizing, the choice between documentation and action, between bearing witness and trying to change the outcome. He'd spent 2 years tallying bodies. Now someone was asking him to try preventing more bodies from needing to be counted. I'm in, he said quietly. I've documented the truth. Time to act on it. Klaus nodded. My father would want this. So would everyone in my battalion who doesn't need to die for a mathematically decided outcome. I'm in. Waldheim sat for a long time, hands folded on the table, staring at Steiner's projections as if the numbers might change if he looked hard enough. Finally, yes. God help us. Yes. Not because I want to betray my oath, but because keeping my oath means watching Germany destroyed completely. Sometimes oath must yield to reality. Brandt pulled out papers, plans that had clearly been prepared in advance. Allied contact protocols. We approach the Americans first, present Steiner's documentation, offer immediate surrender of Western Front while negotiating Soviet terms. If we move fast, the door burst open. Gestapo, 6 men with weapons drawn, moving with the practiced efficiency of a unit that had done this many times before. The room froze. The moment between before and after, between conspiracy and consequence, suspended in the lamplight like insects in amber. The lead agent spoke calmly, almost conversationally. "Gentlemen, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy against the Reich, and defeatist activity." Someone had informed. Someone always informed. Brandt stood slowly, hands visible, maintaining the dignity of a general even in the moment of his own destruction. "On whose authority?" "Reich Main Security Office. You'll be taken to Berlin for interrogation." They were separated immediately. Steiner watched Brandt and Waldheim led away. Watched Klaus push toward a different vehicle. Didn't see any of them again. 3 days later, official notification. General Brandt executed for treason. Field Marshal von Waldheim died during interrogation. The official report said heart attack. Steiner learned later it was poison. Waldheim had carried a capsule for exactly this scenario. Chose suicide over what interrogation would extract. Klaus survived. Junior officer following orders, hadn't actually committed actionable offense beyond being present. Reassigned to frontline unit, watched carefully but alive. Steiner survived. Intelligence officer with valuable documentation the regime still needed. Arrested, interrogated for 2 days, released with warning. His coup attempt noted, filed, held over him as leverage for compliance. The conspiracy had lasted 8 days from conception to collapse. Changed nothing. Cost 2 lives. Proved only that knowing truth and having power to act on truth remain different things. Steiner returned to his office in late December, added Brandt and Waldheim to his ledger. 2 more tallies for arithmetic that continued regardless of whether anyone tried to stop them. The war ground on. The counting continued. The numbers proved patient, inevitable, absolutely precise. And Steiner learned that trying to change the outcome, when trying failed, felt worse than just documenting the disaster, because now he knew what failure looked like, felt like, cost. Now he understood why he'd been counting instead of acting, because counting couldn't fail, documentation couldn't be executed for treason, bearing witness was safe, but Klaus had survived. That was something. Jakob Weber's son lived another 4 months because the coup failed, and he was judged too junior to execute. 4 months. 120 days, before Silo Heights and arithmetic and the final radio transmission. Small victories in a war where victory was mathematically impossible. But Steiner tallied them anyway, because counting was all he knew how to do, even after he'd tried to do more and failed, especially after. Patterson sat forward in his chair, the evening shadows deepening around them. Someone had turned on more lights, but the interrogation room still felt dim, as if the weight of Steiner's story was absorbing the illumination. "The coup," Patterson said carefully. "December 1944. You tried to stop it. You failed. But Lieutenant Weber, Major Weber by then, survived. What happened to him? You said earlier he died at Silo Heights in April 45, 4 months after the coup failed." Steiner's face remained impassive, but Patterson saw his fingers tighten on the water glass. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of a man reciting facts to avoid feeling them. "What happened to Klaus is what happened to everyone who fought past the point where arithmetic said we'd already lost. The numbers caught up with him. That's what numbers do. They're patient, but they always collect their due." He opened his final journal, 1945, written in stark black ink. "This is what it looks like when mathematical projections become physical reality, when counting stops being abstract and becomes personal." January 12, 1945. The Vistula Oder offensive began exactly as Steiner had projected. 2.2 million Soviet troops, 6,000 tanks, 41,000 artillery pieces. Numbers so large they stopped being numbers and became physical force, weight and mass and momentum that simply overwhelmed whatever stood in its path. German defenses collapsed within 72 hours. Soviet tank armies advanced 30 miles per day through the Polish winter, faster than German forces could retreat, certainly faster than they could establish new defensive lines. Poland crossed in 3 weeks. The Oder reached by early February. Steiner documented it all from his office, now relocated to facilities closer to Berlin as headquarters retreated ahead of Soviet advances. Casualty reports, unit identifications, the comprehensive accounting of an army that was dissolving under pressure it could no longer withstand. By February 15th, Soviet forces were 50 miles from Berlin, the capital of the Reich, the heart of the empire that had invaded the Soviet Union, believing it would collapse in weeks, now within reach of the armies Germany had so catastrophically underestimated. The arithmetic was nearly complete, the counting almost finished. February brought Klaus back one final time. Promoted to lieutenant colonel, commanding a Kampfgruppe, battle group, cobbled together from remnants of destroyed units. Old men, teenage boys, officers without divisions, divisions without equipment, the wreckage of an army still fighting because no one had given them permission to stop. He found Steiner in the new headquarters outside Berlin on February 28th. The young man who'd arrived at Steiner's basement office 2 years earlier, believing in German victory, looked decades older. Lines around his eyes that shouldn't be there at 26. Gray threading through his hair at the temples. The physical cost of command, of survival, of watching boys die for arithmetic that had already concluded against them. Sir, I'm being assigned to Silo Heights, last defensive position before Berlin. When the final offensive comes, that's where they'll hit us. Steiner looked up from his casualty reports. Klaus wore the exhaustion of the Eastern Front, like a second uniform, something that couldn't be removed or cleaned or replaced. How many men in your Kampfgruppe? On paper, 800, actually? Maybe 300 combat effective. Average age of enlisted, 16. They issued us Panzerfaust yesterday, anti-tank rockets. Half my boys have never fired one. Most have 3 weeks training. Klaus sat down heavily. Sir, I need to know, honestly, what are we dying for? It was the question Steiner had been avoiding for 2 years. The question that had no good answer, only true ones. Time, he said finally. You're dying to buy time for civilians to evacuate, to let refugees flee west toward American lines instead of east toward Soviet occupation. You're dying because soldiers follow orders even when orders are mathematically pointless. You're dying because someone has to be the last to fall, and it happens to be you. That's not much of a reason. No, it's not, but it's honest. Steiner pulled out his latest assessment. Final Soviet offensive will come within 2 weeks, maybe sooner. They're consolidating forces along the Oder, preparing for the final push. When it comes, you'll face overwhelming odds. 3-to-1 numerical superiority minimum, probably worse. Unlimited artillery support, air superiority, operational doctrine refined through 4 years of combat. You can't stop them, Klaus. No one can. The arithmetic doesn't permit it. Then why fight? Because the boys in your unit deserve a commander who doesn't quit. Because giving up means dying without purpose. Because maybe, just maybe, fighting well gives some of them a chance to survive. He paused. And because someone needs to be the last witness. Someone needs to see it through to the ending. Document what it looks like when arithmetic becomes physical reality. Klaus nodded slowly, accepting what couldn't be changed. You're right. As always. He stood. Sir, if this is the last time, and it probably is, I want you to know. My father was right about you. You're the only officer I've met who saw this war clearly from the beginning, who understood that courage and skill weren't enough against material superiority, who documented the truth even when truth couldn't change anything. Your father was a better man than I am. He would have found a way to make it matter. He would have done exactly what you did, counted accurately, bore witness, made sure someone remembered. Klaus extended his hand. Keep counting, sir. Make sure the final numbers are right. Someone needs to know the real cost. They shook hands. Steiner felt the strength in the younger man's grip, the vitality that was about to be spent buying time measured in hours or days. Stay alive if you can. Klaus, the war needs witnesses more than martyrs. I'll try, but sir, if I don't make it, tell my mother I understood, that I knew what we were fighting for, That it mattered even if it didn't change the outcome. I will. Klaus left. Steiner watched him go, climbing stairs toward a command that would probably kill him within weeks. Jakob Weber's son, aged beyond his years, carrying the weight of soldiers who deserved better than they were getting, the last time Steiner saw him alive. April 16, 1945. The final Soviet offensive began. 2.5 million troops, 6,000 tanks, 41,000 artillery pieces. The accumulated weight of Soviet industrial capacity and 4 years of military development concentrated on a 50-mile front aimed at Berlin. Silo Heights, the position Klaus commanded, was the last natural defensive barrier, the place where Germany would make its final stand before the capital fell. The battle began with artillery bombardment that lasted 4 hours, Soviet guns firing in coordinated patterns, walking shells across every German position, obliterating defenses that had taken weeks to construct. Then searchlights, hundreds of them, pointed at German lines to blind defenders as Soviet tanks advanced through the artificial dawn. Klaus's Kampfgruppe was positioned on the northern edge of the heights. 300 boys with 3 weeks training and insufficient ammunition facing Soviet Guards armies that had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. The battle lasted 3 days. Steiner monitored it from Berlin headquarters, compiling reports that documented the final German stand with the same careful precision he'd applied to every battle since February 1943. April 19, day 3 of Silo Heights. Soviet forces had broken through the main defensive line, were exploiting into German rear areas, encircling the remaining defenders. At 15:30 hours, Steiner's radio crackled to life. Klaus's voice, distant and static-laced, but recognizable. Raven 6 to Eagle Control. Final report for the count. Steiner grabbed the handset with hands that had remained steady through 2 years of war, but trembled now. Eagle Control. Go ahead. Sir, updating casualty figures for historical record. My Kampfgruppe entered battle with 294 combat effectives. Current strength, 6 personnel. Enemy pressure increasing. Position untenable. Request fire mission and covering artillery. Negative on covering artillery. Nothing available. The words tasted like ash, like failure, like all the truth that hadn't mattered. Understood. A pause, static, the sound of something exploding close enough to overload the microphone. Sir, the boys are asking questions. They want to know why we're fighting. What to tell them. Steiner closed his eyes, thought about Jakob, about all the young men who'd asked that question over 4 years of war, thought about arithmetic and production ratios, and the final accounting of a war that had consumed millions for an outcome that had been determined years earlier. Tell them they're buying time for others to escape. Tell them they're doing their duty. Tell them, his voice caught, the only time in 4 years he'd allowed emotion to compromise professional detachment. Tell them I'm sorry, that we failed them, that we saw this coming and couldn't stop it. Klaus's voice came back steady, calm, accepting. The voice of a soldier who'd made peace with what was coming. That's not on you, sir. You warned everyone. You told the truth. That's all anyone could do. Another pause, longer this time. Gunfire in the background, close and getting closer. Sir, my father, he'd be proud I found you, that you taught me to see clearly, to understand what was real. Klaus, evacuate if you can. The war is over. No point dying now. Can't, sir. Boys here deserve a commander who doesn't quit. Besides, the sound of something massive hitting close by, the radio distorting with the pressure wave. Too late for running. Sir, final tally for your records. Kampfgruppe strength, 6 down to 3 now. Average age 15 years. Orders, hold position. Reality, position falling. Final assessment, arithmetic proved conclusive. Klaus, sir, they're coming. Final count, 3 boys. 3 boys between the Soviet army and Berlin. Tell my mother, tell her I understood, that it mattered, that someone had to be last. Static, the sound of small arms fire, very close. Voices shouting in Russian, then Klaus's voice one more time, almost lost in background noise, speaking quickly like a man who knows he's running out of seconds. Keep counting, sir. Make sure the numbers are... The transmission ended, just static. The empty hiss of a frequency with no one left to transmit. The same sound as Stalingrad, as every position that had fallen, as every unit that had been destroyed. The sound of silence where voices used to be. Steiner sat with the dead radio for 5 minutes. 10. 15. Just holding the handset, listening to static, waiting for something he knew wouldn't come. Finally, he set down the handset and made a notation in his log. His hands shook as he wrote, the careful script he'd maintained for 2 years deteriorating into something barely legible. Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Weber died Silo Heights, April 19, 1945, age 26. Kampfgruppe casualties, 100%. Final transmission, 1537 hours. Last words, keep counting. He added the number to his casualty compilation. One more tally in the endless accounting. One more young officer who'd seen the truth and fought anyway, because someone had to be last. Jakob Weber's son. Dead at 26. Defending a position that couldn't be held, buying time measured in minutes, dying for arithmetic that had proven conclusive 2 years earlier. Steiner closed the log and sat in silence, listening to the distant thunder of Soviet artillery drawing closer to Berlin. The arithmetic was nearly complete, the counting almost finished. Soon there would be no more positions to hold, no more soldiers to count, no more war to document, just the final accounting and whatever came after. He sat there as the afternoon became evening, as the sounds of battle drew incrementally closer, as the world he'd documented for 2 years reached its mathematically inevitable conclusion. And for the first time since February 8, 1943, Colonel Heinrich Steiner, who'd counted 4 million casualties with methodical precision, who'd documented every defeat with professional detachment, who'd borne witness to catastrophe without permitting emotion to compromise accuracy, allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd been tallying. Klaus Weber, age 26. Last words, keep counting. The arithmetic was patient. The arithmetic was honest. The arithmetic was complete. But it hadn't counted this, the cost of being the one who survived to do the counting. April 25th, Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Berlin. The city was surrounded, isolated, doomed. The final act of a war that had been decided years earlier, playing out with mathematical precision. April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The man who'd refused every recommendation to accept mathematical reality, who'd chosen ideology over arithmetic, who'd fought beyond all strategic reason, was dead. The system had finally collapsed under its own contradictions. May 2nd, German forces in Berlin surrendered. Fighting continued in isolated pockets, but the capital had fallen. The mathematical endpoint had arrived. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. From the last transmission from Stalingrad to the final surrender, 27 months. Exactly as Steiner had projected in his February 1943 assessment. The arithmetic had been patient, inevitable, absolutely precise. Steiner spent May 8th in his office, compiling the final accounting. The comprehensive casualty report that covered 4 years of war on the Eastern Front. German military casualties, 4.3 million dead. Soviet military casualties, estimated 11 million. Civilian casualties, both nations, uncounted millions more. Production totals, Soviet tanks 1941-1945, approximately 105,000. German tanks, same period, 46,000. Soviet aircraft, 137,000. German aircraft, 94,000. In every category, Soviet material superiority had grown from 2 to 1 in 1943 to nearly 3 to 1 by war's end. The final ratio had determined everything. Tactical excellence, operational art, individual courage, all had mattered, but none had mattered enough to overcome the simple arithmetic of production capacity and replacement rates. Germany had lost this war on February 8, 1943. Everything after had been arithmetic becoming physical reality. The counting made manifest in blood and ruins, and the endless accumulation of young men who died for calculations they couldn't change. Steiner wrote the final line in his journal. Final accounting complete. Total German casualties, Eastern Front, 4,287,000 dead. Soviet casualties, estimated 11,000 plus military, unknown million civilian, War concluded as mathematically projected February 1943. Timeline accurate within 2 months. Cause of defeat, material inferiority 3-1 sustained over 4-year period. Tactical skill insufficient to overcome production disparity. Strategic leadership refused to accept mathematical conclusion until physical collapse made refusal impossible. Documentation complete. Witness born. Count accurate. He closed the journal, filed it with the others. 4 years of careful record keeping. 4 years of bearing witness to a catastrophe everyone could see, but few would acknowledge. 4 years of tallying bodies and calculating ratios and documenting the truth that arithmetic determines outcomes, regardless of will or courage or belief. But the counting wasn't finished. Not quite. There was one more obligation, one more promise to keep, one more witness to face. June 1945, Bavaria. The address Jakob had written in his last letter 7 years earlier, before Moscow, before the Eastern Front had consumed him and eventually his son. Steiner stood outside the modest house, Klaus's final letter in his pocket, the one he'd carried since April 19th, waiting for the war to end before delivering what couldn't be sent through military channels during collapse. Frau Weber answered the door. 60-something, gray hair pulled back, eyes that had already mourned a husband and now waited to mourn a son. She knew before Steiner spoke. The past tense in his stance, in the careful way he held himself, told her everything. Frau Weber, my name is Heinrich Steiner. I served with your husband Jakob and your son Klaus. She knew, but she opened the door anyway, because knowing required hearing, and hearing required letting him speak. They sat in her kitchen. Coffee from real beans, a luxury in occupied Germany. She'd been saving it for news she knew was coming. When? She asked. April 19th, Seelow Heights, the last defensive position before Berlin. Did he suffer? Steiner thought about Klaus's final transmission, the calmness in his voice despite the chaos around him, the acceptance, the clarity even in the moment of his own death. No, he understood what he was fighting for, that it mattered even when it couldn't change the outcome. He asked me to tell you he understood. Understood what? That seeing the truth clearly, knowing the war was lost, didn't make fighting meaningless. It made it honest. That he died with his eyes open, not deluded. That someone had to be last and he accepted that it was him. Steiner pulled out Klaus's letter, the envelope stained with dirt and sweat from his pocket. He wrote this the day before. Asked me to deliver it if he didn't make it back. Frau Weber took the letter with steady hands. Read it in silence while Steiner looked out the window at a Germany that was broken but surviving, occupied but still existing, defeated but somehow still breathing. When she finished, she folded it carefully along the creases Klaus had made. His father wrote me something similar, the week before he died, about how you were the only officer who saw the war honestly, who didn't lie about what was coming. She met Steiner's eyes and he saw in them the terrible weight of maternal arithmetic. 2 Webers lost, 0 returned. Did you lie to my son? Never. Good. Jakob would have wanted that. Truth, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. She stood, moved to the mantel, picked up a photograph. Jakob in uniform, 1918. Young, hopeful, believing the Great War was the last war, the war to end all wars. They called it the war to end all wars, she said, her voice steady but hollow. 30 years later, my husband and son are both dead in wars that never ended anything, just continued. She set down the photo with careful precision. Tell me, Colonel, what did they die for? It was the question Steiner had been asking himself for 2 years, the question Klaus had asked on the radio before the transmission ended, the question that had no good answer because the arithmetic didn't care about meaning or purpose, or the need for grieving mothers to find sense in senseless loss. They died because arithmetic determines outcomes and leaders refused to accept numbers. They died because Germany fought beyond strategic reason, beyond mathematical possibility, beyond the point where surrender would have saved millions. They died because seeing truth and having power to act on truth are different things. He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man who understood their weight. Jakob and Klaus both saw clearly. That didn't save them, but it meant they died honest. not deluded, not believing in lies. They knew what they were fighting for, even if what they were fighting for was just buying hours for others to escape. That's something. Is it enough? No, but it's all I can offer. Frau Weber nodded slowly, a gesture that acknowledged the inadequacy of truth when measured against loss. Then I'll accept it, because the alternative is believing they died for nothing, and a mother can't accept that, even when it might be true. Steiner left the house carrying the weight of that conversation. Two Webers, father and son, dead for a war that had been mathematically decided years before they fell, and one old woman who had to construct meaning from meaningless loss because the alternative was unbearable. He walked through Bavaria in the summer of 1945, Germany occupied and broken and somehow still existing, wondering if Frau Weber would read Klaus's letter again, if she would find comfort in knowing her son had died seeing clearly, if that understanding would make the loss bearable or make it worse. The arithmetic hadn't cared. The counting had continued regardless of understanding or meaning or comfort. 4 million deaths between February 1943 and May 1945. Klaus Weber was one number in that accounting. His mother's grief was not in the ledger, but Steiner had delivered the letter, kept his promise. That was something. Maybe not enough, but something. The Americans captured Steiner in May 1945, Wehrmacht colonel with comprehensive intelligence documentation spanning the entire Eastern Front. They recognized the value immediately. Not as a war criminal, his work had been analytical, not operational, and his records proved he'd warned against strategic mistakes repeatedly. Not as a collaborator, his documented coup attempt in December 1944 showed he'd tried to end the war. But as a witness, someone who documented everything, who could provide evidence for tribunals, who could help piece together what had actually happened in a war that had consumed millions. They offered him a choice: Soviet captivity or cooperation. The Soviets wanted all German intelligence officers for their own purposes. The Americans wanted the intelligence officers' records. Steiner chose survival, chose to finish the counting he'd started, chose to make sure Klaus's last words, "Keep counting, make sure the numbers are right," meant something. 7 years of providing testimony, answering questions, watching his journals become evidence in tribunals and strategic assessments. 7 years of watching the war he'd documented become the history he'd predicted it would become. 7 years of living while Klaus and Jacob and 4 million others hadn't. By 1952, most interrogations were complete, most trials finished, most immediate questions answered. But the U.S. Army Historical Division kept interviewing, kept collecting, kept building the comprehensive record that would explain how Germany lost a war it had once seemed destined to win. Which brought Major Patterson to that interrogation room on a September afternoon, 7 years after the surrender, looking for someone who'd counted accurately and could explain why counting hadn't mattered. Patterson set down his pen. 9 hours had passed. The tape reels had been changed 3 times. The story was complete, from February 1943 to May 1945, from first recognition to final accounting. "Colonel Steiner," Patterson said quietly, "one final question. After everything, after documenting it all, after trying to stop it and failing, after watching Klaus die and delivering that letter to his mother, how do you live with it? How do you carry that weight?" Steiner looked at his hands on the table. Hands that had written 4 years of casualty reports. Hands that had held Klaus's last letter. Hands that had documented 4 million deaths with methodical precision. You learn that doing what you can is enough. Even when what you can do is just bearing witness. Even when truth doesn't change outcomes. He looked up, meeting Patterson's eyes. You count, you document, you remember. You carry the weight of the dead not because it helps them, but because someone has to. Because Klaus Weber and Jakob Weber and 4 million others deserve to be remembered accurately. Not as propaganda heroes or noble sacrifices, as young men who died for a war that was mathematically lost before they fell. He stood slowly, gathering his journals. 4 years of documentation, 4 years of truth that hadn't changed anything except the historical record. Every number in those journals was someone's son, someone's father, someone's Klaus. I knew the final count in February 1943. I just couldn't stop it. So I counted them instead, made sure each one was recorded. That's how you live with it. You witness, you document, you remember, and you hope that someday someone learns something from the truth you preserved. Patterson stood, extending his hand across the table. Thank you, Colonel, for your honesty, for your records, for bearing witness when no one else would. They shook hands. Steiner picked up his satchel, the leather worn smooth by years of carrying truth no one wanted to hear. He walked to the door, paused, looked back at the tape reel still slowly turning, capturing everything. Major Patterson, one thing more. Steiner's voice carried a different weight now, the professional detachment stripped away. When you write this history, when you compile these testimonies into whatever document explains how we lost, remember that we weren't blind. We weren't stupid. We saw the arithmetic clearly. We just couldn't stop the machine. I'll remember. Steiner nodded once and left the interrogation room. Patterson watched him go. This colonel who'd counted his way through catastrophe, who'd documented disaster with methodical precision, who'd borne witness to the slow-motion suicide of a nation that chose ideology over arithmetic. The tape reels continued their rotation for another minute before Patterson reached over and pressed stop. The story was complete. The counting was finished. The truth preserved for whoever came after. Steiner walked through this September afternoon, 54 years old now, carrying journals that weighed nothing physically and everything historically. 7 years since Klaus died. 7 years since Jacob's sacrifice was completed in his son's death. 7 years of surviving while better men hadn't. He'd kept his promises, delivered Klaus's letter to his mother, preserved the records for future historians. Counted accurately until the arithmetic was complete. Born witness when witness was all anyone could offer. It wasn't redemption, couldn't be redemption because the dead stayed dead, regardless of documentation. But it was honest. And in a war where truth had been the first casualty and arithmetic the final judge, honesty was all he'd ever had to give. The counting was finished, the arithmetic complete, the truth preserved. 4 million Germans and 11 million Soviets had died for a war that production ratios had decided in February 1943. Klaus Weber was one of them. Jakob Weber was one of them. Every number in Steiner's ledger had been someone's son, someone's father, someone's Klaus. He'd counted them all, made sure each one was recorded, bore witness to arithmetic becoming reality. That was his war, not the fighting, but the counting, not the dying, but the documenting. It had to be enough, because it was all that remained. The autumn wind carried the scent of rebuilding, of a Germany that was learning to live with its history, with its choices, with the mathematical consequences of fighting beyond the point where numbers said to stop. Somewhere in that wind, Klaus Weber was 26 forever, asking questions about why they were fighting, dying before anyone could give him an answer that made the arithmetic matter less. Somewhere, Jakob Weber was proud that his son had learned to see clearly, even though clarity hadn't saved him. Somewhere, 4 million others were numbers in Steiner's journals, tallies in his careful accounting, evidence that wars are won by those who can produce tanks faster than the enemy can destroy them. The arithmetic had been conclusive. The counting was finished. The truth preserved. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And sometimes Steiner had learned over 4 years of war and 7 years of peace, honesty was all anyone could offer. Sometimes it had to be enough, because nothing else remained.